Lillian Harper didn't scream when the wagon wheel snapped and threw her into the mud in front of the whole congregation. She just stood up, wiped the blood from her split lip, and stared down every last soul who'd laughed. Nobody moved to help her, except one man. A stranger on a horse hat, low jaw tight, who swung down and knelt in that mud beside her like she was the only person left standing in Copper Creek worth kneeling for. If you want to see what happens when a broken woman meets a man who refuses to look away, hit subscribe. Stay with me to the very end and drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. The mud was cold even in June, and that was the first thing Lillian Harper noticed as she lay in it colder than it had any right to be colder than the sun should have allowed. The second thing she noticed was the laughter. It came from every direction at once, a ring of voices closing around her like a noose made of sound. "Well, look at that," a woman's voice said, sharp as a slap. "The bride can't even walk straight down the church steps." Wasn't the steps someone else called? Wasn't nothing but her own clumsy feet. Lillian pressed her palms flat against the mud and pushed herself up onto her knees. Her good dress, the only dress she owned that didn't have a patch on it, was ruined, now soaked through and brown from collar to hem. Blood filled her mouth where her teeth had caught her lip in the fall, and she swallowed it rather than let them see her spit. She would not cry. She had promised herself that on the stagecoach 3 days ago, when the driver had asked her not unkindly whether she had family waiting on the other end. She'd told him no. She'd told him she was going to be married. She hadn't told him the man she was set to marry had taken one look at her scarred hands and broken shoes at the church door and announced loud enough for the whole town to hear that he wasn't fixing to spend his life married to some worn-out mill girl who couldn't even afford a proper hem. "Ain't my fault," Thomas Whitfield had said, backing away from her at the altar rail like she carried a fever. Letter said she was a respectable woman. Look at her. Hands like a field hand. I got standards. And then he'd shoved past her, shoved with his shoulder hard enough that she'd stumbled off the step and into the mud, where half of Copper Creek now stood, laughing at her like she was a show put on for their entertainment. "Somebody help her up," a thin voice said from the back of the crowd. A boy's voice, maybe 10 years old, but a woman's hand clamped down on his shoulder and pulled him back. "You leave her be," the woman hissed. "That's what happens to women who come here chasing husbands they got no business chasing." Lillian got her feet under her. Her knees shook, but she stood. She looked at every face in that crowd, the banker's wife with her powdered cheeks curled up in disgust. The preacher standing on his own church steps saying nothing, doing nothing. The men who'd turned their eyes away because watching a woman fall was fine, but helping her up was somehow beneath them. She had scrubbed floors in a Boston tenement until her knuckles cracked and bled. She had worked a cotton mill from before dawn until after dark, 6 days a week for 6 years, until the noise of the looms lived permanently behind her eyes. She had buried a mother who died coughing blood into a rag because there was no money for a doctor. She was 25 years old, and she had never once in all that time let anyone see her break. She was not going to start now in the mud in front of strangers. "Obliged for the honesty," Lillian said, and her voice did not shake, though everything inside her did. Better to know a man's a coward before the ring than after. Someone in the crowd gasped, like she'd cursed in church. Thomas Whitfield's face went red. "You watch your mouth," he snapped. "I have watched it my whole life," Lillian said. "Watched it say yes when I meant no. Watched it stay quiet when it should have shouted. I reckon I'm done watching it now." That was when the sound of hooves cut through the crowd's murmuring, slow, deliberate, unhurried, like the rider had all the time in the world, and didn't care who knew it. Lillian turned one hand pressed to her ruined dress and saw him. He was tall, even sitting a horse broad through the shoulders, in a way that spoke of work rather than leisure, and there was a thin white scar cutting across one cheekbone that caught the light when he tilted his head. His hat was pulled low, but not so low she couldn't see his eyes, gray steady, and fixed on her like she was the only thing in Copper Creek worth looking at. He swung down off the horse in one clean motion and walked straight through the crowd, and the crowd for reasons Lillian couldn't understand, yet parted for him without a word. "Caleb Grayson?" A man near the front muttered, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like fear. The stranger, Caleb, didn't stop at the edge of the mud. He walked right into it, boots and all, and knelt down in front of Lillian like the filth on the ground meant nothing to him. "You hurt bad, ma'am?" he asked. His voice was low, rough at the edges, like it didn't get much use. "I'll live," Lillian said. "Didn't ask if you'd live, asked if you're hurt." She stared at him. Nobody had asked her that question, not really asked it wanting an honest answer in longer than she could remember. "My lips split," she admitted. "Pride's worse." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough kin to one. He stood, and without asking permission, without waiting for her to protest, he stripped off his coat and set it around her shoulders. It smelled of wood smoke and leather and horse, and it was warm from his body, and Lillian had to fight the sudden humiliating urge to weep at the simple decency of it. "Now see here," Thomas Whitfield said, puffing his chest out. "This ain't your business, Grayson. This woman was promised to me, and I found her unfit. Ain't nothing more to discuss." Caleb turned his head slowly, and the look he gave Thomas Whitfield made the other man take a step back without seeming to realize he'd done it. "Unfit," Caleb repeated. "Man leaves a woman face down in the mud in front of the whole town and calls her unfit. Reckon I've got a different word for what's unfit here, Whitfield, and it ain't standing in the mud." "You don't know anything about her," Whitfield snapped. "No, she didn't cry," Caleb said. "No, she got back up on her own before anybody so much as offered a hand. No, she called you a coward to your face with blood still in her mouth. That tells me plenty." The crowd had gone quiet now, the kind of quiet that comes when people realize they might be about to watch something they'll talk about for years. "She's got no family here." The preacher finally spoke up, his voice thin and useless. "No place to stay." The letter of introduction named her as promised to Mr. Whitfield, and if that arrangement's broken, I don't rightly know what's to become of her. Caleb was quiet a moment, his gray eyes moving from the preacher to Whitfield to the crowd, and then back to Lillian. She watched him decide something, watched the exact moment his jaw set, and his shoulders squared, like a man picking up a weight he intended to carry all the way home. "I'll take her," Caleb said. The words dropped into the crowd like a stone into still water, and the ripples spread out in gasps and whispers. "Take her where?" Whitfield demanded. "Up the mountain," Caleb said. "I run cattle, and I got a cabin needs a woman's hand in it, and I got no patience for gossip or games. She wants honest work and a roof. I'll give her both. Contract terms. Same as any. I'd offer a hired hand. She cooks. She keeps the place, and in return, she's fed, housed, and treated with respect. Nothing more expected of her than that unless she chooses different." Lillian's chest tightened. She looked up at him, really looked past the scar and the steady eyes and the coat still warm around her shoulders, and asked the only question that mattered. "Why?" Caleb met her eyes without flinching. "Because I've seen what this town does to people. It decides ain't worth the trouble," he said. "And I don't much care for it." That's not an answer. "It's the only one I've got right now," Caleb said. "You want a better one, you'll have to ride up the mountain and ask me again in a week." Behind them, the preacher was already stammering something about propriety, about a woman traveling alone with a man she'd just met, about what such an arrangement would look like, but Lillian was no longer listening to him. She was looking at the mountain, rising blue and distant behind Caleb Grayson's shoulder, and she was thinking that whatever waited for her up there, it could not possibly be crueler than what waited for her down here. "I have $4 to my name," she said, "and I know how to cook, clean, mend, and work a garden. I don't know the first thing about cattle or mountains, and I won't pretend otherwise." "Didn't ask you to pretend anything," Caleb said. "That's more honesty than I've had from most men in this town in a year. And if I say no, then I tip my hat and ride on and you find your own way," Caleb said. "Ain't a trap, ma'am. It's an offer." Lillian looked once more at the crowd, at the banker's wife's curled lip, at the boy whose mother had yanked him back, at Thomas Whitfield still red-faced and sputtering about standards, and she made her decision the way she'd made every decision in her hard life, quickly and without looking back. "Then I accept your offer, Mr. Grayson," she said. "On one condition." State it. I'm no man's hired hand and no man's obligation. I'll work honest for honest keep, but I'll not be spoken to the way that man spoke to me back there. Not ever." Caleb studied her for a long moment, and something in his gray eyes shifted. Respect maybe, or the beginning of it. "Ma'am," he said, "you got my word on that." He held out his hand not to shake, but to help her up onto the wagon seat, and Lillian, who had not accepted help from anyone in longer than she cared to remember, found herself taking it. The wagon ride out of Copper Creek was silent for the first hour, and Lillian was grateful for it. Her lip throbbed. Her dress, stiff with drying mud, chafed against her skin. And underneath all of it sat a hard, cold knot of humiliation that no amount of silence could loosen. Caleb drove with his eyes fixed on the road, his hands loose on the reins. His hat tipped just enough to shade his face from the afternoon sun. He didn't ask her questions. He didn't offer conversation. And for that first hour, Lillian almost respected him for it, until the silence began to feel less like courtesy and more like judgment. "You're not going to ask me anything," she finally said. "Didn't figure it was my business," Caleb said, not looking at her. "You just took a stranger off the street in front of half a town. Seems like it became your business the moment you did that." Caleb's mouth twitched again, that almost smile. "Fair point. So ask." He was quiet a moment, considering. "Why'd that letter say you were promised to a man you'd never met?" Lillian's hands tightened in her lap. "Because I answered an advertisement. Widower seeking wife, honest labor, respectable character required. I had honest labor coming out my ears, and no husband and no prospects, and a landlord fixing to put me out on the street inside the month. Seemed like the only door still open. And the millwork man back there said your hands looked like a field hand's. 6 years at a cotton mill in Boston," Lillian said, and there was no shame in her voice, only fact. "Before that, scrubbing other people's floors. My mother died 3 winters back, and there wasn't money for a doctor, and after that, there wasn't much reason to stay in that city besides habit." Caleb nodded slowly, like he was turning her words over in his mind, testing their weight. "That letter you answered," he said. "Whitfield's letter. You know he's buried 2 wives already." Lillian's stomach turned cold. "No, I did not know that." "First one died of a fever. Nobody called for a doctor over. Second one left in the night, and nobody's heard from her since. Town talks about it plenty, just not to strangers' faces." Caleb's jaw was tight. "You dodged worse than mud today, ma'am, whether you know it yet or not." Lillian said nothing for a long moment, watching the road curve up toward the foothills, the town shrinking behind them into a smudge of rooftops and church steeple. "Why does the town fear you?" she finally asked. "Man said your name like it cost him something to say it." Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. "Some folks in Copper Creek got reason to remember what happens when a man protects what's his and don't much care for polite conversation about it." "That's not an answer either. Getting to be a habit of mine," Caleb admitted, and this time the almost smile made it all the way to a real one, brief as it was. "There was a land dispute some years back. Man tried to run cattle through my grazing without paying for the right, tried to bully me off ground my father worked before me. I didn't back down. Things got ugly before they got settled. Town remembers the ugly part and forgets the settling." Lillian studied his profile, the scar on his cheekbone, the set of his jaw, the way his eyes never quite softened, even when his voice did. "Is that where the scar's from?" Caleb's hand moved unconsciously to his cheek, then dropped back to the reins. "That's a story for another day, ma'am." "Fair enough," Lillian said. "I've got plenty of stories I'm not fixing to tell today either." They rode on the sun climbing higher, the June heat pressing down thick and dry. And somewhere in the silence between them, something had shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of something that might one day grow into it. The road narrowed as it climbed the wagon wheels, catching on roots and stones, the trees closing in tighter overhead until the sky was only a strip of blue far above them. Lillian's dress had dried stiff and brown against her skin, and the heat of the day pressed down on her shoulders like a hand. "How much farther?" she asked. 2 hours, maybe 3, Caleb said. Cabin sits high past the timberline where the grass runs sweet for the herd. You live alone up there. Have for 6 years. No family. Caleb's jaw tightened just slightly, just enough that Lillian noticed. Had a brother. Don't anymore. She didn't press. She recognized the shape of that kind of silence. She'd worn it herself for 3 winters now since her mother's death. And she knew better than most that some grief didn't want company, only quiet. The wagon jolted hard over a root, and Lillian gripped the seat to keep from sliding. Caleb reached out without thinking and steadied her with one hand on her arm before pulling back like he'd touched fire. Apologies, he muttered. No need, Lillian said. Would have been worse to fall off a wagon than a church step, I expect. That earned her the closest thing to a laugh she'd heard from him. Yet a short exhale through his nose, barely more than breath, but real. By the 3rd hour, the heat had thickened into something oppressive, and Lillian's throat was dry as chalk. She said nothing about it. She had learned long ago that complaining bought a person nothing but scorn, but Caleb noticed anyway the way he seemed to notice everything without appearing to look. There's a canteen behind the seat, he said. Drink. I'm fine, ma'am. His voice carried an edge now, not unkind, but firm. Man who lets a woman go thirsty on his own wagon because she's too proud to ask ain't much of a man. Drink the water. Lillian reached back and found the canteen and the water warm, as it was tasted better than anything she'd had in weeks. She didn't thank him. She wasn't sure yet how to thank a man for kindness without it feeling like a debt she couldn't repay. You don't talk much, she said instead. Never had much reason to, Caleb said. Cattle don't care for conversation. Mountain doesn't either. And people, Caleb said, have mostly given me reason to keep my mouth shut. I know that feeling. He glanced at her, then really looked at her the way he had back in the mud outside the church, and something passed between them that neither of them had words for yet. You're not what I expected, he said. Nobody ever is, Lillian said. That's usually the problem. Tja. They stopped once near a creek running cold and clear off the mountainside to water the horse and rest a moment in the shade. Lillian knelt at the creek's edge and splashed water on her face, scrubbing at the dried mud until her skin was raw and clean. And when she looked up, Caleb was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between curiosity and something softer, something he seemed determined not to let take root. You've got grit, he said. I'll give you that. Grit's about all I've got left, Lillian admitted. Everything else got used up a long time ago. Don't believe that. You don't know me well enough yet to say otherwise. Maybe not, Caleb said. But I know enough. Woman falls in the mud in front of a whole town and doesn't cry, doesn't beg, doesn't fold. That's not a woman with nothing left. That's a woman who's learned not to show what she's got, because showing it costs too much. Lillian's breath caught just slightly at how close that landed to the truth. You're perceptive for a man who claims he doesn't talk much. Talking and seeing are different skills, Caleb said, standing and brushing off his knees. I got plenty of the second and not much use for the first. They climbed back onto the wagon and pressed on, and as the afternoon wore toward evening, the trees began to thin, giving way to open meadow, and Lillian caught her first glimpse of the cabin. Small, weathered set against a backdrop of granite peaks that caught the last gold light of the day. It was not what she'd imagined. It was smaller, rougher, more solitary than any home she'd pictured for herself, even in her most desperate moments in Boston. Smoke had not risen from its chimney in some time, judging by the state of the yard overgrown and untended, more a bachelor's outpost than a home. It ain't much, Caleb admitted, following her gaze. I know that. It's more than I had this morning, Lillian said. This morning I had nothing but $4 and a torn dress. Well, Caleb said, drawing the wagon to a stop in the yard. Reckon that makes 2 of us with less than we started the day with. I came down that mountain a man with no obligations, and I'm coming back up it with a wife I ain't married and a hired woman I ain't hired. Town's going to talk plenty about that. Let them talk, Lillian said, climbing down from the wagon before he could offer his hand. I've had worse said about me by better people. Caleb studied her a long moment in the fading light, and something in his gray eyes, steady, careful, guarded, softened just enough to let a flicker of warmth through. Come on then, he said. Let's see what you make of it. Tug. The inside of the cabin told its own story before Caleb said a word about it. A single room, mostly a stone hearth, cold and dark. A table scarred with knife marks, a bed in the corner made with military precision, and everywhere else the marks of a man who lived only for what was necessary and nothing more. No curtains. No decoration. A rifle hung above the door, and another leaned against the wall by the bed within easy reach. There's a loft, Caleb said, pointing to a ladder in the corner. You'll sleep up there. I sleep down here. Sensible, Lillian said, though her eyes were moving over the room, cataloging everything the way she'd once cataloged a mill floor for Hazard's habit, born of necessity. Kitchen's there, Caleb continued, nodding at a corner with a stove, a wash basin and shelves, half stocked with tins and dried goods. Ain't fancy. I mostly eat what's fast and don't spoil. I can see that, Lillian said, and there was no judgment in her voice, only observation. Caleb set her small bag, the only luggage she'd carried, off the stagecoach down by the ladder. Terms are simple. You keep house, cook, mend what needs mending. I work the herd, bring in supplies, handle what needs handling outside. Come winter, if you're still here, we'll talk about wages proper. For now, you've got food and shelter, and my word, you won't be treated the way that town treated you. And if I decide I don't want to stay, then I'll take you back to town myself. No hard feelings, Caleb said. Door's not locked, never will be. Lillian nodded slowly, taking that in. Fair enough. She set about examining the kitchen while Caleb went to see to the horse, and it was there alone in the fading light that she allowed herself for just a moment to feel the full weight of the day. Her lip throbbed. Her body ached from the wagon and the fall. And underneath it all sat a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with the physical journey and everything to do with 6 years of swallowing humiliation, 6 years of being told she was less than she was. But there was also unexpectedly something else, a flicker of something she hadn't let herself feel in a very long time, possibility. She found flour, salt, a bit of salt pork, and set to making what she could of a supper, and by the time Caleb returned from the barn, the smell of cooking filled the small cabin for what she suspected was the first time in longer than he'd admit. He stood in the doorway a moment just looking, and something in his face, hard set, guarded, carved by years of solitude, cracked just slightly at the edges. Smells like something, he said. It's just biscuits and salt pork, Lillian said. Nothing fancy. Ma'am, Caleb said, and his voice had gone rough in a way that had nothing to do with roughness. I haven't smelled fresh biscuits in this cabin since my mother passed. Fancy's got nothing to do with it. They ate at the scarred table in near silence. But it was a different silence than the one on the wagon, softer, less guarded, punctuated by small exchanges that felt, to Lillian's surprise, almost like the beginning of something. You're a fine cook, Caleb said when the plates were empty. I had practice. Feeding myself was cheaper than starving. Boston teach you that too. Boston taught me a lot of things, Lillian said. Mostly, how to survive people who thought less of me than they should have. Caleb was quiet a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. This town's not much different, I'm sorry to say. Copper Creek's got a way of deciding who matters and who doesn't, and it don't much care about being fair in the deciding. I noticed. You'll have folks talk about you, Caleb warned. Living up here with me unmarried. Won't be kind talk. I've survived unkind talk before, Lillian said. I expect I'll survive it again. Caleb studied her across the table, the lamplight catching the scar on his cheek, and something passed between them. Not quite trust, not yet, but the seed of it planted deep in the hard soil of two people who'd both learned the cost of hoping for too much. I meant what I said today, he said quietly, about treating you with respect. You've got my word. I believe you. Lillian said, and found to her own surprise that she meant it. That night, lying in the loft on a straw mattress that smelled of cedar and dust, Lillian listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain wind through pine, the distant call of some night bird, the creak of the cabin settling, and found despite everything that sleep came easier than it had in months. Below her, she could hear Caleb moving quietly around the cabin, banking the fire, checking the door. The small rituals of a man who had lived alone so long that solitude had become its own kind of comfort. She wondered briefly what had happened to the brother he'd mentioned, and refused to speak of further. She wondered about the scar on his cheek, and the story he'd said was for another day. She wondered whether a man who'd knelt in the mud for a stranger might, given time, become something more than a stranger himself. She did not let herself wonder too long. Hope, she'd learned, was a dangerous indulgence for a woman who'd been disappointed as many times as she had. But as she drifted toward sleep, she found her hand resting on the coat Caleb had wrapped around her shoulders that morning, still smelling of wood smoke and leather, and something in her chest, long dormant, stirred with the smallest flicker of warmth. Morning came early and hard, with Caleb's boots on the ladder rungs and his voice gruff, but not unkind, calling up that there was work to be done before the heat set in. Lillian dressed quickly in the only other clothing she owned, a plain work dress, sturdy and unremarkable, and climbed down to find Caleb already at the stove, attempting with limited success to coax a fire to life. "You've been doing this 6 years alone?" she asked, taking the kindling from his hands with the easy authority of someone who'd built 100 fires out of necessity. "Man learns to survive on what he's got," Caleb said, stepping back to let her work. "Don't mean he's good at it." Within minutes, Lillian had the fire crackling and coffee brewing, and Caleb watched her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man recalibrating his expectations in real time. "There's a garden plot out back," he said. "Gone to weed. My mother kept 1 year's back before—" He stopped himself. "Before your brother," Lillian said gently, not quite a question. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Before a lot of things." "I'd like to see it," Lillian said, letting the subject drop. "The garden, if it's not too much trouble." "No trouble," Caleb said clearly, relieved at the change of subject. "Show you after breakfast." They ate quickly. Eggs from the small coop out back, more of the biscuits from the night before, and then Caleb led her out to the garden plot, overgrown with weeds and choked with neglect, but the bones of good soil still visible beneath. "This could be something," Lillian said, crouching to examine the dirt, running it through her fingers. "Rich soil. Whoever planted this first knew what they were doing." "My mother," Caleb said quietly. "She had a gift for growing things. Died when I was 19. Fever took her quick same summer my father passed from a fall off a ridgeline chasing a stray steer. Left me and my brother the place, and neither of us had much heart for gardening after that." "I'm sorry," Lillian said, and meant it. "Long time ago now," Caleb said, though his voice suggested otherwise. "Doesn't mean it stops hurting," Lillian said. "I lost my mother 3 winters back. Some days it still catches me by surprise, like walking into a door I didn't see." Caleb looked at her, then really looked, and something passed between them. Recognition maybe of 2 people who'd both learned to carry grief quietly without spectacle, because spectacle had never once made the grief lighter. "If you want to work the garden," Caleb said, "tools are in the barn. Take whatever you need." "I'd like that," Lillian said. "Something about growing things feels like it might do me some good." "Might do us both some good," Caleb admitted, and then, as if surprised at his own honesty, turned quickly toward the barn to see to the horses. Cow. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them had expected, but both quietly welcomed. Caleb rose before dawn to see to the cattle, and Lillian rose not long after to tend the cabin and increasingly the garden, which under her care began slowly to shed its wild neglect and take shape again. Rows of beans squashed the first hopeful shoots of corn. They spoke more each day, though never in long stretches. Caleb's nature ran toward economy of words, and Lillian, though more talkative by inclination, had learned in Boston that unwanted chatter earned a person nothing but scorn. But in the evenings over supper, something had begun to grow between them that neither dared name yet, an ease, a comfort, the beginnings of trust laid brick by careful brick. It was on the fifth evening that the first real crack in Caleb's careful reserve appeared. They were sitting on the porch after supper, the mountain air finally cooling, as the sun dropped behind the western ridge, when Lillian asked the question she'd been holding back for days. "Tell me about your brother." Caleb's whole body went still. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer at all. "Name was Daniel." He finally said, his voice rough. 2 years younger than me. Good with horses in a way I never was. Reckless in a way that used to scare our mother half to death. What happened to him? Caleb's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. There was a man came through here 4 years back. Silas Bordeaux. Claimed to hold paper on grazing rights that ran clean through our land, tried to run his cattle through our best pasture without so much as asking. I told him no. Told him our father's claim was filed proper and legal, and there wasn't a paper in the territory that said otherwise. And Daniel had a temper I didn't have the patience to manage, Caleb said. Confronted Bordeaux's men alone one night trying to prove something to me, I think trying to show he wasn't the reckless younger brother everybody figured him for. Things went bad. Shots got fired. Daniel didn't come home. Lillian's breath caught. "Caleb, I'm so sorry. I got there too late." Caleb continued, his voice flat. Now the flatness of a man who'd told himself this story 1,000 times in the dark and worn all the feeling out of the words. "Found him in the grass, still breathing barely. Died before I could get him back to the cabin. Bordeaux's men scattered before the sheriff ever showed. Never faced a single charge for it." "Is that where the scar came from?" Caleb's hand moved to his cheek. "Fight with one of Bordeaux's men few weeks after. I wasn't in my right mind. Wanted somebody to pay for what happened to Daniel, and I found somebody who was willing to give me this instead." He touched the thin white line. "Man nearly took my eye. I gave him worse in return, and that's the part of the story this town remembers. Not that I lost my brother, not that justice never came, just that Caleb Grayson's a dangerous man not to be crossed." "That's not fair," Lillian said quietly. "Fair's got nothing to do with what people choose to remember," Caleb said. "I learned that a long time ago." They sat in silence a while, the last light fading from the sky, and Lillian found herself reaching over, without quite deciding to, and resting her hand over his on the arm of the chair. Caleb went still at the contact, but he didn't pull away. "For what it's worth." Lillian said, "I don't think you're a dangerous man. I think you're a man who loved his brother and never got to grieve him properly because the whole town was too busy being afraid of you to let you." Caleb's throat worked, and for a moment Lillian thought she saw something bright and unshed in his eyes before he blinked it away. "Nobody's said that to me in 4 years," he said quietly. "Then it was past time somebody did." It was 3 weeks into her stay when the first real trouble arrived. Trouble that would reveal just how deep the town's cruelty ran, and just how far Caleb Grayson was willing to go to stand against it. Lillian had gone into Copper Creek with Caleb for supplies, standing at his side in the general store, while he settled accounts with the shopkeeper, when the door opened and Thomas Whitfield walked in, flanked by 2 other men Lillian didn't recognize. "Well, if it isn't the mud bride," Whitfield said loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Grayson still keeping you as his charity case, or has he found other uses for you by now?" The insinuation hung ugly in the air, and Lillian felt her face flush hot with humiliation. But before she could respond, Caleb had crossed the store in 3 long strides and had Whitfield by the collar, backed hard against the shelves close enough that the other man's face had gone pale. "You'll apologize to her," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous in a way Lillian had never heard from him. "Right now in front of everybody in this store, or so help me." "Caleb." Lillian's voice cut through the tension, calm and steady despite the racing of her own heart. "Let him go." Caleb's grip didn't loosen. "He insulted you. He's a small man who spent his whole life insulting people to feel bigger than he is," Lillian said. "Beating him won't change that. Let him go, Caleb. He's not worth what it'll cost you." For a long moment, Caleb didn't move, his jaw tight, his knuckles white against Whitfield's collar. Then slowly he released him, and Whitfield stumbled back against the shelves, gasping. "You're a menace, Grayson," Whitfield said, straightening his coat with shaking hands. "Whole town knows it. Just like your brother was a menace before you got him killed with your stubbornness." The words landed like a physical blow. Caleb went rigid, and Lillian saw in that instant a version of him she hadn't seen before, something raw and wounded beneath the careful control, something that Whitfield's cruel words had torn open like an old wound reopened. "Get out!" Caleb said, his voice shaking now with barely contained fury. "Get out of this store before I forget the promise I made to the lady standing next to me." Whitfield fled, his companions trailing after him, and the store fell into an uncomfortable silence, every eye fixed on Caleb and Lillian. Lillian took Caleb's arm gently, deliberately, and felt the tremor running through him. "Let's go home," she said quietly. They rode back to the cabin in silence, the tension between them thick as the summer heat, and it wasn't until they'd unloaded the wagon and stood alone in the yard that Caleb finally spoke. "He wasn't wrong," Caleb said, his voice hollow. "About Daniel. If I'd handled things different." "Stop," Lillian said, stepping in front of him, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You didn't get your brother killed. Silas Bordeaux's men got your brother killed. A cruel man in a store trying to hurt you doesn't get to rewrite that truth just because it's easier for people to blame the man standing in front of them than the men who ran off before facing justice. You don't know that it isn't true." "I know grief lies," Lillian said. "I know it whispers terrible things in the quiet hours and tells you every terrible outcome was somehow your fault. I've heard those same lies about my mother's death, about not finding a doctor in time, about failing her when she needed me most. Grief lies, Caleb. Don't let it." Caleb stared at her for a long moment, something fracturing behind his careful gray eyes, and then for the first time since she'd known him, he let himself lean forward and rest his forehead against hers, his breath unsteady, his hands finding her shoulders like an anchor in a storm. "I don't know how to stop believing it," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then let me remind you," Lillian said, "every single day until you do." They stood like that in the fading light, two broken people finding in each other the first real foundation neither of them had felt in years, and somewhere in the mountains above them, a summer storm was gathering, dark clouds building slow and heavy over the peaks. Though neither of them noticed yet, too caught up in the fragile, dangerous hope blooming between them to see the trouble still to come. Because Thomas Whitfield was not a man who forgot humiliation easily, and Silas Bordeaux's business in these mountains, Lillian would soon learn, was far from finished. The storm broke 2 nights later, rolling down off the peaks with a violence that rattled the cabin's shutters and turned the yard to churning mud. Lillian woke to thunder cracking so close it seemed to split the sky directly over the roof, and by the time she'd climbed down from the loft, Caleb was already at the door, rifle in hand, staring out into the sheeting rain. "Cattle," he said before she could ask. "Storm like this can spook the whole herd into a ravine if they bolt wrong. I have to go." "In this?" Lillian crossed the room, alarm rising fast in her chest. "Caleb, you can't see 10 feet in front of your own hand out there." "Can't leave 200 head to the storm either," he said, already pulling on his slicker. "Lost a third of the herd 2 years back to a night just like this one. Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anybody but me." "Anybody meaning who?" Caleb's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Lillian saw real fear behind his eyes. Not for himself, she realized, but for her. "Whitfield's the kind of man who nurses a grudge till it goes rotten," he said. "And Bordeaux's men have been seen on the lower roads again this past week. Storm like this is good cover for a man who don't want to be seen coming." "You think someone would come here tonight? I think I'd rather you bar the door and be wrong than leave it open and be sorry," Caleb said. And then he was gone, swallowed whole by rain and darkness, and Lillian was alone in the cabin with nothing but the storm and her own racing heart for company. She barred the door as he'd told her. She fed the fire, and then she sat at the scarred table with a knife from the kitchen close at hand, listening to the wind try the shutters like something testing for weakness, and did not sleep at all. It was near dawn when she heard hoofbeats in the yard. Not one horse, but several, and her whole body went rigid with the kind of fear she hadn't felt since her worst nights in Boston, alone in a rented room with a door that didn't lock right. "Caleb," she called low, her hand tightening on the knife. No answer. Just the creak of saddle leather and low voices outside, men's voices, none of them his. "Open up in there," a voice called, rough and unfamiliar. "We know Grayson ain't home. Herd scattered clean across the north pasture. Man's gonna be gone till sunup chasing strays, and we got business to discuss with the woman he's keeping." Lillian's blood went to ice. She backed away from the door knife, raised eyes darting to the rifle hung above the doorframe, too high to reach quickly, too far from where she stood. "I've got a gun," she called back, and prayed her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "And I know how to use it." A laugh, ugly and unhurried. "Mill girl like you, doubt that very much, ma'am." The door shuddered under a fist, once, twice, the bar groaning in its brackets, and Lillian's mind raced through everything Caleb had told her about Bordeaux, about the grazing rights, about men who came in the night, when a man was too busy to protect what was his. "This is Bordeaux's business," she said, thinking fast, throwing words at the door like they were the only weapon she had left. "Grayson land, ain't it? You come sniffing around here again, and it's not going to be a scar you leave this place with. It'll be a grave. I've heard what happened to the last men who tried this." There was a pause, a real one, long enough that Lillian let herself hope. "Feisty," the voice said. "Bordeaux said the mill girl had some fight left in her. Didn't figure he was right." "Tell your Mr. Bordeaux," Lillian said, forcing steel into every word, "that he can come say his business to Caleb Grayson's face like a man, or he can keep sending cowards to rattle a door in the middle of a storm. Either way, I'm not opening it." Another laugh, but this one had an edge of uncertainty in it now. "We'll be back, ma'am. Tell Grayson his time's running short. Bordeaux's filing paper on this land inside the month, and there ain't a judge in the territory gonna side with a man who's already killed once over grazing rights." The hoofbeats retreated into the storm, and Lillian sank down against the door, her whole body shaking, the knife clattering from fingers gone numb with adrenaline. She did not cry. She had promised herself long ago she would not cry. Not for men like this, not for a night like this. But she allowed herself finally to shake, to feel the full weight of how close danger had come. When Caleb burst through the door an hour later, soaked to the bone, mud to his knees, his face went white at the sight of her still sitting against the doorframe. "Lillian." He was on his knees beside her in an instant, hands framing her face, checking her over with a desperation that stripped away every careful wall he'd built around himself. "Did they touch you? Did they—" "I'm fine," Lillian said, though her voice wavered. "They didn't get in. I made sure of that." "Who was it? How many?" "3, maybe 4. Said they worked for Bordeaux." She met his eyes, steadying herself with the truth of it. "Said he's filing paper on this land inside the month. Said no judge would side with a man who's already killed once." Caleb's face went through something violent and complicated, fury, and beneath it all a grief so old it had calcified into something harder than either. "They threatened you," he said low. "They tried to," Lillian corrected. "I didn't let them succeed." Caleb's hands were still on her face, and for a long moment neither of them moved. The storm still raging outside, the fire burned down to embers, and something between them shifting into a different shape entirely. No longer just an arrangement, no longer just two strangers under one roof. "I could have lost you," Caleb said, and his voice broke on the word, lost in a way that told Lillian exactly how much had changed in 3 short weeks. "You didn't," she said. "I'm still here." "I can't lose anybody else," Caleb said. And it wasn't about the land anymore, wasn't about Bordeaux or grazing rights or even Daniel. It was raw and immediate and entirely about her. "I won't survive it a second time." "Then don't leave me alone in a storm again," Lillian said. "And I won't give you the chance to." It was meant perhaps as something light, something to break the terrible tension of the night. But Caleb's face went suddenly achingly serious, and before Lillian understood what was happening, his hand had moved from her cheek into her hair, and his forehead rested against hers, his breath ragged and close. Lillian. He said her name rough in his mouth like it cost him something precious to say it. Caleb. Neither of them moved for a long moment, close enough that Lillian could feel the warmth of him, even through her fear, even through the cold that still clung to her bones from sitting so long against that door. And then, slowly, carefully, like a man diffusing something dangerous, Caleb pulled back. "I'm sorry," he said. "That wasn't—" "Don't apologize," Lillian said quietly. "I didn't ask you to stop, because I wanted you to." Caleb's eyes searched hers, gray and uncertain in the low firelight. "This ain't the arrangement we made." "No," Lillian agreed. "It isn't." "I don't know what to do with that." "Neither do I," Lillian admitted. "But I know I'd rather sit here not knowing with you than go back to a world where I knew exactly what to expect, and every bit of it was cruel." Caleb let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for years, and reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything the town believed about him. "Bordeaux's not going to stop," he said. "You should know that before you decide anything more about staying. I didn't survive a Boston mill in a cruel town and a man who left me face down in the mud just to run from the next hard thing," Lillian said. "I'm not going anywhere, Caleb." Morning brought clear skies and hard decisions. Caleb rode out at first light to survey the damage to the herd 3 had lost to the ravine. A dozen more scattered across the north pasture, and returned grim-faced and silent, the events of the night settling into something colder and more purposeful behind his eyes. "I'm riding into town," he told Lillian over a hurried breakfast. "Need to speak with the land office, see what paper Bordeaux's actually filed, if any. Man's bold, but he's not always honest about how bold he's entitled to be." "I'm coming with you." "Lillian, you said yourself I'm not safe alone up here," she said, meeting his eyes with the same steel that had kept Bordeaux's men outside her door the night before. "And I've got $4 and a decent hand for figures. If there's fraud in that paperwork, I might see something the land office clerk misses." Caleb studied her a long moment, and something in his expression, pride maybe, or the beginning of something even more dangerous to a man who'd sworn off feeling anything at all, softened the hard line of his mouth. "All right," he said. "But you stay close. Whitfield or Bordeaux's men so much as look at you wrong, we're leaving." Agreed. The ride into Copper Creek was different this time. Not silent, not strained, but filled with a new kind of urgency, the two of them talking in low, quick exchanges about what they might find, what Bordeaux's angle might be, what a fraudulent land claim might look like on paper. "My father filed our claim the year I was born." Caleb explained, his hands steady on the reins despite the tension in his shoulders. "Territorial Land Office in Denver holds the original. If Bordeaux's got papers saying otherwise, it's forged, plain and simple." "Forged paper's hard to prove without the original to compare it against," Lillian said. "You have a copy." "Somewhere in my father's old strongbox. Haven't looked at it in years." "We should look tonight," Lillian said, "before Bordeaux gets any further with whatever he's planning." Caleb glanced at her, something like wonder in his gray eyes. "You think like a lawyer." "I think like a woman who spent 6 years watching mill owners cheat workers out of wages with paperwork nobody bothered to read closely," Lillian said. "Fraud's got a particular shape to it once you've seen enough of it." The land office in Copper Creek was a narrow building squeezed between the general store and the bank and the clerk behind the counter. A nervous young man named Percy Adkins went pale the moment Caleb walked through the door. "Mr. Grayson," Percy stammered, "I wasn't expecting—" "Bordeaux filed paper on my grazing land," Caleb said. "No preamble, no patience for pleasantries. I want to see it." Percy's eyes darted toward the back office where Lillian could see a shadow moving behind a frosted glass door. "Mr. Grayson, I don't rightly know that I'm authorized to—" "You're authorized to show a landowner the paper filed against his own property." Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous, in a way Lillian recognized from the general store. "That's the law, Percy, and you know it. And The shadow behind the frosted glass moved closer, and the door opened to reveal a man Lillian had never seen before, tall, silver-haired, dressed in a suit too fine for a town like Copper Creek, with the kind of smile that never once reached his eyes. "Mr. Grayson," the man said smoothly. "I was hoping we might have this conversation eventually. Silas Bordeaux. I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Don't need an introduction to a man who sends his hired guns to threaten a woman in the middle of the night," Caleb said, and Lillian felt the whole room's temperature drop several degrees. Bordeaux's smile didn't waver, but something flickered behind his eyes. Calculation, maybe, or the first sign of a man realizing his plans had encountered an obstacle he hadn't fully accounted for. "I'm afraid I don't know anything about that," Bordeaux said. "Rough men do rough things in this territory without waiting on my instruction, Mr. Grayson. Surely you understand that better than most given your own brother's unfortunate history." Lillian felt Caleb go rigid beside her, the muscle in his jaw jumping, and she reached out quickly and closed her hand around his forearm, not to restrain him, but to remind him she was there, that he wasn't facing this alone, the way he'd faced Daniel's death 4 years before. "You've got some nerve," Lillian said, stepping forward before Caleb could respond. "Invoking a dead man's name to distract from the fact that you sent armed men to threaten an unarmed woman in a storm." Bordeaux's cool eyes settled on her for the first time, assessing, calculating. "And you would be the mill girl from Copper Creek's little wedding scandal. My word does travel fast in a small town. I'd be the woman who told your men to their faces that they were cowards for hiding behind a storm instead of facing Mr. Grayson honestly," Lillian said. "Seems that description fits you equally well, Mr. Bordeaux." Something tightened around Bordeaux's mouth, the first genuine crack in his composure before he smoothed it over with practiced ease. "I admire spirit," he said. "Even misplaced spirit. Percy, show Mr. Grayson the filing." Percy's hands shook as he retrieved a folder from a cabinet behind the counter, and Lillian watched Caleb's face as he scanned the document inside, watched the color drain from his cheeks, watched his hands tighten until his knuckles went white against the paper. "This is forged," Caleb said, his voice flat and dangerous. "This signature isn't my father's. I've seen his hand 1,000 times, and this isn't it." "That's a serious accusation," Bordeaux said, still smiling. "One you'd need to prove in a courtroom against a filing that's already been notarized and accepted by this office." "Notarized by who?" Lillian asked sharply, her mind already working through the mechanics of fraud, the way she'd learned to in Boston, watching mill owners falsify wage ledgers and safety inspections alike. Because a notary's seal means nothing if the notary himself was paid to look the other way. Bordeaux's eyes flickered to Percy just for a moment, just long enough that Lillian caught it and knew with sudden clarity that she'd found the crack in the whole scheme. "That's a serious accusation to level against an officer of this territory," Bordeaux said, but there was something brittle in his voice now that hadn't been there before. "Then let's take it to a judge and let him decide," Caleb said, folding the document and tucking it inside his coat before Percy could protest. "Federal Circuit Judge comes through Cheyenne Crossing next month. I'll have my father's original claim in hand, and this forgery to compare against it, and we'll let the law sort out who's lying." Bordeaux's composure cracked fully for just a moment, a flash of real anger behind the cultivated calm, before he reasserted control with visible effort. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Grayson," Bordeaux said quietly. "I have resources in this territory that extend well beyond one small land office. I'd think carefully before deciding to fight this in a courtroom." "I've been threatened by better men than you," Caleb said. "And I buried the last man who thought threats would work on me. Best remember that before you send any more of your hired guns near my land." They left the land office with the forged document in Caleb's coat, and Bordeaux's cold eyes following them out the door, and it wasn't until they were well clear of town, the wagon rattling up the mountain road, that Lillian allowed herself to breathe fully again. "That was reckless," she said, "taking the document like that." "That was the only proof we've got that he's lying," Caleb said. "Couldn't leave it behind for Percy to burn the moment we walked out the door. You think the clerk's part of it? I think a man who goes that pale and shaky doesn't do it because he's innocent," Caleb said grimly. I think Bordeaux's got his hooks in half of Copper Creek one way or another, and we just made an enemy of a man with more money and more reach than either of us can match alone." Lillian was quiet a moment, watching the mountain rise ahead of them, dark and solid against the afternoon sky. "Then we don't fight him alone," she said finally. "We find your father's original claim tonight, and tomorrow we start finding out exactly how deep Bordeaux's fraud runs. If he forged one document, chances are good he's forged others. Men like that don't stop at one lie." "You sound certain of that. I watched mill owners cheat 100 women out of wages with false ledgers for 6 years, Lillian said. "I know exactly how far men like Bordeaux are willing to go once they realize nobody's watching closely enough to catch them." Caleb glanced at her, something like awe mixing with the grim determination on his face. "You're not what I expected when I knelt down in that mud 3 weeks ago." "You said that already." "Bears repeating," Caleb said. "Every day I learn something new about you that makes me grateful I did." That night, by lamplight, they searched the old strongbox that had belonged to Caleb's father, sorting through yellowed papers, brittle deeds, and the small remaining artifacts of a family that had once been whole. Lillian found herself moved unexpectedly by the fragments of history laid bare on the scarred table. A marriage certificate, a child's drawing a letter in a woman's careful hand that could only have been Caleb's mother. "This is it," Caleb said, finally pulling a folded document from the bottom of the box, the paper soft with age, but the ink still clear. "Original claim filed the year I was born. My father's signature notarized by the territorial office in Denver." He laid it beside the forged document, and even Lillian, unfamiliar with either man's hand, could see the difference immediately. The original's confident looping script against the forgery's careful, too precise imitation. "It's not even close," she said. "Whoever forged this wasn't skilled enough to be convincing." "Wasn't trying to be convincing to someone who'd actually compare them," Caleb said. "Was trying to be convincing to a land office clerk too scared or too paid off to look too closely. We need more than just the comparison." Lillian said, her mind already working ahead. "We need to know who else Bordeaux has cheated. If there's a pattern, a judge will see it far more clearly than one forged document standing alone." "You think there are others? Men like Bordeaux don't stop at one target," Lillian said. "I'd wager good money there are other ranchers, other small landholders around Copper Creek who've had their own trouble with paperwork these past few years. We should ask around, quietly." Caleb studied her across the lamplit table, something warm and fierce kindling behind his careful gray eyes. "You're talking like a woman who intends to fight this alongside me." "I am a woman who intends to fight this alongside you," Lillian said. "Unless you've got some objection." "No objection," Caleb said, his voice low. "Just gratitude I didn't know I had room left for." He reached across the table and took her hand, and this time neither of them pulled away. The days that followed carried a new urgency, a shared purpose that deepened the bond between them, even as it exposed them both to greater danger. Caleb rode to neighboring ranches under the pretense of routine visits, quietly asking after land disputes, deed troubles, any hint of paperwork gone wrong in recent years. And what he found confirmed Lillian's suspicions in ways more troubling than either of them had anticipated. 3 other families, it emerged, had lost portions of their land to Bordeaux's company in the past 2 years, each time through paperwork disputes that had somehow always resolved in Bordeaux's favor. The Hendersons, an aging couple with no sons to fight for them, had lost their eastern pasture entirely. The Millers had been forced to sell at a fraction of value after a forged tax lien nearly cost them everything. And a widow named Sarah Cole, living alone on a small plot near the river, had simply vanished from the county records after Bordeaux's men paid her a visit. Nobody in town seemed to know where she'd gone or seemed inclined to ask too closely. "That's not coincidence," Lillian said when Caleb relayed what he'd learned. "That's a pattern. He targets people without strong protection. Widows, old couples, folks without money for lawyers or friends in the territorial office." "And I fit that pattern, too," Caleb said grimly. "Man living alone, no family to speak for him town, already half convinced I'm dangerous because of what happened with Daniel. Easy target if you look at it the way Bordeaux does." Except he made one mistake, Lillian said. What's that? He didn't count on you not being alone anymore. Caleb's eyes met hers, something fierce and grateful passing between them, and for a moment the danger and the fraud and the whole tangled mess of Bordeaux's scheme fell away, leaving only the two of them standing closer than the arrangement between them had ever technically allowed. Lillian, Caleb said quietly, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honest, all right? 3 weeks ago I offered you a contract. Work for keep respect, nothing more expected unless you chose different. His voice roughened. I'm asking now if you'd choose different. Lillian's heart pounded against her ribs. What are you asking me, Caleb? I'm asking if there's room in whatever this is between us for something more than an arrangement, Caleb said. I'm asking because I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the moment you looked up at me out of that mud and told a whole town of cowards exactly what you thought of them. I'm asking because for the first time in 4 years, I've got something to fight for beyond just surviving, and it's you. Lillian felt tears threaten for the first time since the church steps, and this time she let them come because these were not tears of humiliation, but of something else entirely. Something she hadn't dared hope for since long before her mother's death, since long before the mill. Since a time so far back, she'd nearly forgotten what hope felt like. There's room, she said, her voice thick. There's been room since you knelt down in that mud, Caleb. I just didn't know if I was allowed to want it. Caleb's hand came up to cup her face, gentle, in a way that stood in stark contrast to the danger surrounding them both. And this time, when he leaned down, he did not pull away. The kiss was soft, at first hesitant. Two people testing ground neither had expected to stand on again, and then it deepened, carrying all the weight of everything unsaid between them since that first ride up the mountain. All the careful walls each had built to survive their separate griefs, finally gently coming down. When they broke apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers, breathing unsteady, and Lillian felt something settle inside her chest that had been unsettled for longer than she could remember. This complicates things, Caleb murmured. Only if you let it, Lillian said. Seems to me it simplifies things a good deal. Now I know exactly why I intend to fight Silas Bordeaux with everything I've got. And that reason would be, because I'm not losing this, Lillian said fiercely. Not you, not this mountain, not the first real home I've had since my mother died. Bordeaux picked the wrong woman to threaten in a storm. Caleb's laugh was rough, surprised, genuine, a sound Lillian suspected the mountain hadn't heard from him in years. Remind me never to underestimate you again. I intend to, Lillian said, every single day. Yee. But Copper Creek was not finished with them yet, and the fragile happiness they'd found together was about to be tested in ways neither of them fully anticipated. It happened on a Sunday, 10 days after the confrontation at the land office, when Caleb and Lillian rode into town for supplies and found the streets unusually crowded, a tension in the air that Lillian recognized immediately as trouble brewing. Something's wrong, she murmured, and Caleb's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle at his side. They found the source of the commotion outside the sheriff's office, a small crowd gathered around a notice posted on the door, and at the center of it, Silas Bordeaux, standing with the sheriff himself. Both men wearing expressions of grave concern that Lillian instinctively distrusted. Mr. Grayson, Sheriff Coburn called when he spotted them approaching. Been meaning to have a word with you. About what? Caleb's voice had gone hard, wary. About a complaint filed against you, the sheriff said, and there was something apologetic in his tone that did nothing to ease Lillian's growing sense of dread. Mr. Bordeaux here has filed a formal accusation of theft. Says you removed a legal document from the land office without authorization. That document was a forgery, Caleb said. I removed evidence of fraud, not stolen property. That's not what the notarized filing says, Bordeaux interjected smoothly. And until a judge determines otherwise, Mr. Grayson, the law's got to treat that document as legitimate property of this office, which means you're in violation of territorial statute. You forged that document, Lillian said, stepping forward, her voice sharp enough to cut through the crowd's murmuring. We have proof, His father's original claim filed and notarized properly in Denver, with a signature that doesn't match what's on the paper Mr. Bordeaux filed. A private citizen's opinion on handwriting isn't evidence, ma'am, Bordeaux said, his smile never wavering. That's precisely the sort of thing a judge is meant to determine in a proper court, with proper counsel. Something Mr. Grayson, I understand, has never had the resources to secure. The implication was clear cruel, and calculated Bordeaux had money for lawyers. Caleb had none. And in the space between those two facts lay the entire architecture of the fraud Bordeaux had been running for years. "Sheriff," Caleb said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "You know my family. You knew my father. You know I've never stolen a thing in my life." Sheriff Coburn's eyes flicked briefly toward Bordeaux, and something in that glance told Lillian everything she needed to know about where the sheriff's true loyalties, or at least his fears, actually lay. "I know what I know, Grayson," the sheriff said carefully. "But I've got a formal complaint filed and a notarized document as evidence, and until this gets sorted proper in front of a judge, I'm going to need you to surrender the document you removed. And if I refuse, then I'll have grounds to arrest you for theft and obstruction," the sheriff said, clearly uncomfortable with the words even as he said them. "I don't want to do that, Caleb, but you're not leaving me much choice." The crowd had gone silent watching, and Lillian felt the old familiar helplessness of watching a powerful man use the machinery of law and money to crush someone weaker. The same helplessness she'd felt watching mill owners escape consequence after consequence, while workers suffered for crimes they hadn't committed. But this time, she was not going to stand silently by. "Sheriff Coburn," she said, stepping forward with a boldness that surprised even herself. "If Mr. Grayson surrenders that document, it will disappear from this office, the same way it appeared conveniently and in Mr. Bordeaux's favor. I'd wager everything I own that document goes missing within the week, right alongside whatever else in this office might prove Mr. Bordeaux's been forging land claims across this whole territory." "That's a serious accusation, young lady," Bordeaux said, his composure finally visibly cracking. "It's a serious pattern," Lillian shot back. "The Hendersons, the Millers, a widow named Sarah Cole, who vanished from county records the same month your men paid her a visit. How many others, Mr. Bordeaux? How many families have you cheated out of their land with forged paper and threats in the dark, counting on nobody being brave enough to stand against you?" The crowd's murmuring rose again, different this time, uncertain, questioning the first cracks of doubt appearing in faces that had moments before seemed ready to side with money and power over truth. "Is that true?" a voice called from the crowd. The Hendersons' neighbor Lillian realized an old rancher named Cutter she'd heard Caleb mention. "Bordeaux, is that woman telling the truth about the Hendersons?" "I don't answer to accusations from hysterical women," Bordeaux snapped, and the crack in his composure widened further, the cultivated charm slipping to reveal something colder, more desperate underneath. "Hysterical," Lillian repeated, and let the word hang in the air a moment before continuing, her voice carrying clear across the gathered crowd. "I stood in the mud outside this very church 3 weeks ago while half this town laughed at me, and not one person called that hysteria. But a woman pointing out a pattern of fraud that's cost decent families their land and livelihoods, that's hysteria. Is it, Mr. Bordeaux? Seems to me the only thing hysterical here is a man so afraid of being caught that he's resorting to insults instead of answers." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between the pressure of Bordeaux's money and the growing unease of the crowd around him. "Sheriff," Caleb said, seizing the moment, "I'm not surrendering evidence of fraud to the very office where that fraud was committed. But I'll gladly present it to a federal circuit judge alongside my father's original claim and testimony from any family in this county who's lost land to Bordeaux's schemes. If I'm wrong, let the judge say so. But I won't hand proof of a crime back to the man who committed it." Sheriff Coburn was quiet a long moment, torn visibly between two pressures, and finally reluctantly he nodded. "Circuit judge comes through Cheyenne Crossing in 3 weeks' time," he said. "I'll hold off on any arrest till then, Grayson, but you'd best have solid proof when that judge arrives, or I'll have no choice but to act on this complaint." 3 weeks, Caleb said. "We'll be ready." Bordeaux's cold eyes swept over the crowd, over the doubt now visible on faces that had once seemed solidly in his favor, and something dangerous settled behind his practiced smile. 3 weeks, he agreed softly. A great deal can happen in 3 weeks, Mr. Grayson. I'd advise you to consider your position very carefully before then. The threat, thinly veiled, as it was hung in the air like smoke. And as Bordeaux turned and walked away, his men falling in step behind him, Lillian felt Caleb's hand find hers, gripping tight. "That wasn't a warning about the court case," she said quietly. "No." Caleb agreed, his voice grim. "That was a threat against everything I've got left to lose, and he just found out exactly what that is." He looked at her. Then gray eyes fierce with a protectiveness that went far beyond any contract or arrangement, and Lillian understood with sudden clarity that the danger surrounding them had just shifted from a fight over land into something far more personal, far more dangerous. "We need to find the Hendersons," Lillian said. "The Millers. Anyone willing to testify against him. If we're going to survive the next 3 weeks, we can't do it alone." "No," Caleb agreed. "We can't." He pulled her close right there in the street, in full view of whatever remained of the crowd, and Lillian understood that whatever careful distance had once existed between them was gone, now burned away by shared danger and shared purpose alike. "I'm not losing you to that man," Caleb said fiercely against her hair. "Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, I'm not losing you the way I lost Daniel." "You won't," Lillian promised. Though even as she said it, a cold thread of fear wound through her chest, because Silas Bordeaux was not a man who made empty threats, and somewhere in the 3 weeks that stretched ahead of them, Lillian knew with the same instinct that had once warned her away from dangerous mill machinery and drunk foremen alike that Bordeaux intended to make good on every word of it. The Hendersons lived 4 miles east in a small house that had clearly once been prosperous and now wore neglect like a wound that hadn't healed right. When Caleb and Lillian arrived the next morning, an old man answered the door with a shotgun half raised before recognition softened his weathered face. "Grayson," he said, "didn't expect to see you out this way." "Cutter told you what happened in town yesterday?" Caleb asked. "Word travels fast in a county this small." The old man's eyes moved to Lillian, assessing. "You're the mud bride, the one who stood up to Bordeaux in front of the sheriff." "Lillian Harper," she said, extending her hand. "And I'd very much like to hear what happened to your eastern pasture, Mr. Henderson, if you're willing to tell it." Henderson's jaw worked for a long moment, old anger and older fear warring behind his eyes. "My wife's inside. She don't like talking about it. Broke something in her when we lost that land, something that ain't mended since." "I understand," Lillian said gently. "I lost my mother to men who didn't care whether she lived or died, so long as their profits stayed steady. I know what it costs to talk about a wound that's still open." Something in her voice must have reached him because Henderson stepped back from the door and gestured them inside. The story poured out slowly, painfully over cups of weak coffee at a table that had seen better decades. 2 years back, Bordeaux's men had arrived with paperwork claiming a tax lien on the Hendersons' eastern acreage paperwork. The old man swore he'd never signed, never even seen before that day. When he'd refused to honor it, Bordeaux's men had returned at night, burned half his hay stores, and made it clear, without ever saying so directly, what might happen to an old man and his wife living alone if he continued to resist. "We signed it over," Henderson said, his voice thick with shame. 40 acres of the best grazing land in this county gone for pennies on the dollar, because I was too old and too scared to fight a man with Bordeaux's money and Bordeaux's guns." "That's not shame, Mr. Henderson," Lillian said firmly. "That's survival. There's no dishonor in surviving." "Will you testify?" Caleb asked. "Before the circuit judge when he comes through Cheyenne Crossing." Henderson's hands trembled around his coffee cup. "Bordeaux finds out I'm testifying against him before that judge arrives, my wife and I won't live to see the hearing." "We'll protect you," Caleb said. "With what?" Henderson's laugh was bitter. "You've got a cabin and a herd of cattle, Grayson. Bordeaux's got money enough to hire every gun in the territory." Lillian leaned forward, her voice low and urgent. "Mr. Henderson, If you don't testify, if the Millers don't testify, if nobody stands up and tells the truth about what Bordeaux's done, he wins. Not just against Caleb, against every family he's cheated and every family he'll cheat next. Somebody has to be first. Somebody has to be brave enough to say enough. The old man was quiet a long moment, staring into his coffee like it might offer answers. Then from the doorway behind him, a new voice spoke. "I'll testify." Lillian turned to find an elderly woman standing there, thin and stooped, but with eyes that burned fierce despite her frailty. Mrs. Henderson clearly listening from the next room. "Martha," Henderson said, alarm coloring his voice. "You don't have to. I've been ashamed of what that man did to us for 2 years, Elias." Martha Henderson said, her voice trembling, but resolute. "I've watched you carry that shame like it was yours to bear, when the only shame in this belongs to Silas Bordeaux. I'm done being quiet. I'll stand before that judge and tell him exactly what happened and exactly who's responsible." Henderson stared at his wife for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes, and then he nodded, slow and resolute. "All right," he said. "All right, Martha. We'll testify, both of us." Lillian felt something fierce and hopeful bloom in her chest, and beside her, Caleb reached for her hand, gripping it tight. "Thank you," Caleb said. "Both of you. This takes more courage than you know." "Courage," Martha said, "or just being too old and too tired to be afraid anymore. Either way, Mr. Grayson, you tell that judge everything, and you make sure Silas Bordeaux answers for what he's done." The Millers proved harder to convince. A younger couple with 3 small children, they had far more to lose and far less resolve to risk it, and their first conversation ended with the husband, Robert Miller, refusing outright. "I've got children to think of," he said, standing in his doorway with his arms crossed, unwilling even to invite them inside. "Bordeaux already took half our good land. I'm not risking what's left for a fight that ain't mine to win." "It became your fight the day he cheated you," Lillian said. "Refusing to testify doesn't make you safer, Mr. Miller. It just makes Bordeaux bolder." "Easy for you to say," Miller shot back. "You don't have 3 children who'd starve if something happened to me." The words landed hard, and Lillian felt the sting of them, even as she recognized the fear driving them. She glanced at Caleb, saw the frustration tightening his jaw, and made a decision. "Mr. Miller," she said, softening her voice, "I understand fear. I've lived with it my whole life. Fear of starving, fear of being thrown away, fear of men with more power than conscience. I'm not asking you to be fearless. I'm asking you to imagine what happens to your children's future and every other family's children in this county if men like Bordeaux learn that fear always wins, that nobody will ever stand up to them no matter what they take." Miller's composure cracked just slightly, and his wife appeared behind him in the doorway, her face pale but her eyes steady. "Robert," she said quietly, "the Mudbride's right. We can't keep living scared forever. Sooner or later, he'll take everything piece by piece, and we'll have spent all that fear for nothing." Miller looked between his wife and Lillian, and something in his resolve finally broke. "I need time to think," he said. "That's all I can promise right now." "That's more than we had an hour ago," Caleb said. "Thank you for hearing us out." They left the Miller homestead with cautious hope, and as they rode back toward the cabin, Lillian found herself turning over everything they'd learned, every piece of the puzzle Bordeaux had constructed across the county. "We still need to find Sarah Cole," she said, "the widow who vanished from the county records." "If she's even still alive," Caleb said grimly. "We have to try," Lillian insisted. "If Bordeaux did something worse to her than fraud, that changes everything. That's not land theft anymore. That's murder." Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. "You think he's capable of that? I think a man who forges documents, burns hay stores, and sends armed men to threaten women in storms is capable of far worse than we've imagined," Lillian said. "I think we need to find out exactly how far Silas Bordeaux is willing to go before that circuit judge arrives." "There, They found Sarah Cole's abandoned property 2 days later, a small cabin near the river choked with weeds and neglect clearly untouched in months. Inside, they found signs of a hasty departure, clothing left behind, dishes still in the wash basin, a child's rag doll forgotten in the corner of a small bedroom. "She had a child," Lillian said softly, picking up the doll with careful hands. "Nobody mentioned that. Because nobody in town wanted to think too hard about what happened to a widow and her child," Caleb said grimly. "Easier to assume she moved on than to ask uncomfortable questions about a powerful man's business." They searched the property for clues, finding little beyond the evidence of abandonment, until Lillian discovered a torn scrap of paper wedged behind a loose floorboard near the hearth, a hiding place clearly deliberate and desperate. "Caleb!" she called, and something in her voice brought him instantly to her side. "Look at this." The paper was a fragment of a letter, water-stained and torn, but the words still legible enough to send a chill through both of them. "If anything happens to me, know that Bordeaux threatened to take my son unless I signed. I'm running before he can make good on it. If you're reading this, I'm sorry I couldn't stay and fight. Please, whoever finds this, don't let him do this to anyone else." "She's alive," Lillian breathed. "Or she was when she wrote this. She ran Caleb. She got away." "But where?" Caleb's face was grim. "And how do we find a woman who's spent months hiding from a man with Bordeaux's resources?" Lillian was quiet a moment, thinking hard, drawing on instincts sharpened by years of navigating danger in Boston's worst corners. "Railroad," she said finally. "If she was running with a child, she wouldn't risk the open road. She'd have taken the railroad north toward Cheyenne Crossing, where there's enough people to disappear into. It's also where the circuit judge holds his hearings." "You think she's still there?" "I think if she's smart, and everything about that letter tells me she's smart, she stayed close enough to testify if the chance ever came, without staying close enough for Bordeaux to find her first," Lillian said. "We should ask around when we go for the hearing, discreetly." Caleb studied her with something like awe. "You've got a mind for this kind of thing." "I've got a mind for survival," Lillian said. "Sarah Cole and I aren't so different when it comes down to it. Just women who learned the hard way that surviving means thinking 2 steps ahead of the men trying to destroy us." That night, back at the cabin, exhaustion and grief from the day's discoveries settled heavy over both of them. Lillian sat by the fire, the child's rag doll still clutched in her hands, unable to shake the image of a mother running through the night with nothing but fear and a sleeping child to guide her. "You're thinking about Sarah Cole," Caleb said, settling into the chair beside her. "I'm thinking about every woman Bordeaux's ever threatened," Lillian said. "How many of us have to run or hide or swallow our fear and sign away everything we've got before someone finally stops him?" Caleb reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles against her knuckles. "You're not going to have to run, Lillian. I promise you that." "You can't promise that," Lillian said, though she didn't pull her hand away. "Bordeaux's already threatened me once. He'll do it again, especially now that we're building a case against him." "Then I'll be standing between you and every threat he sends," Caleb said fiercely. "I already lost Daniel to this man's cruelty. I'm not losing you too." Lillian turned to face him, fully searching his gray eyes in the firelight. "You keep saying that like you think I'm made of something fragile that needs protecting." "I don't think you're fragile," Caleb said. "I think you're the strongest person I've ever known. But strong don't mean untouchable, Lillian, and I'll be damned if I stand by and let anything happen to you when I've got breath left to prevent it." Something in his voice, raw and unguarded, broke through the last of Lillian's careful reserve, and she leaned forward, resting her head against his shoulder, letting herself, for just a moment, be held, instead of holding everything together alone. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. "I haven't let myself say that out loud since my mother died, but I'm scared, Caleb. Of Bordeaux, of losing this, of losing you. I'm scared too." Caleb said, his arms coming around her, solid and warm and real. "But we're scared together now. That's different than being scared alone." They sat like that a long while, the fire burning low, the weight of Bordeaux's threat pressing against the fragile piece they'd built together, and neither of them heard the soft sound of hoofbeats stopping a quarter-mile down the mountain road, nor saw the shadow of a man dismounting, moving carefully through the darkness toward the cabin's edge. The attack came just before dawn, sudden and violent, shattering the fragile peace of the night. Lillian woke to the smell of smoke and Caleb's voice shouting her name, and by the time she'd scrambled down from the loft, the barn was already engulfed in flames, orange light flickering wild against the dark mountain sky. The herd... Caleb was already at the door, rifle in hand, his face carved from fury and fear. "Stay inside, bar the door." "No," Lillian said, grabbing her own coat. "I'm not staying behind while you face this alone. Not after last time." There was no time to argue. They ran together toward the barn, the heat of the fire pressing against them like a living thing. And through the chaos, Lillian caught sight of shadows moving at the tree line, men on horseback watching, waiting, the flickering firelight catching the barrel of a rifle raised and aimed. "Down!" Caleb tackled her hard, throwing them both to the ground as a shot cracked through the night air, splintering wood inches from where they'd been standing. "They're trying to kill us!" Lillian gasped, adrenaline and terror screaming through her veins. "They're trying to scare us!" Caleb corrected grimly, pulling her behind the water trough for cover. "Bordeaux wants us alive to sign away the land. Dead men don't sign contracts." Another shot rang out, closer this time, and Caleb returned fire toward the tree line, his movements precise and controlled, despite the chaos surrounding them. "The horses," Lillian said suddenly. "Caleb, they're trying to burn the barn to force the herd into panic, drive them toward the ravine again." "I know," Caleb said grimly. "It's exactly what happened 4 years ago with Daniel. Except this time, I'm not losing anybody." He moved fast, decisive, directing Lillian toward the relative safety of the cabin's stone foundation, while he worked to free the terrified cattle from the burning barn's edge, his movements sharp with the kind of controlled fury that came from watching history threaten to repeat itself. Lillian, refusing to simply hide, grabbed a bucket and began fighting the fire's edge alongside him, ignoring his shouted protests, her hands blistering against the heat as she worked to keep the flames from spreading toward the cabin itself. "Get back!" Caleb yelled, as a support beam cracked and fell, sending sparks showering across the yard. "Not until this fire's out!" Lillian shouted back, refusing to retreat even as smoke stung her eyes and throat raw. It took nearly an hour to bring the fire fully under control. The barn itself a smoking ruin by the time the last flames died, but the cabin stood, and more importantly, both of them stood too exhausted and soot-stained, but alive. The shadows at the tree line had vanished sometime during the chaos, leaving behind only the wreckage of their intent, a warning unmistakable and brutal of exactly how far Bordeaux was willing to go. "He's escalating," Lillian said once the immediate danger had passed, sitting exhausted against the cabin wall, her hands raw and blistered. "This isn't about land anymore, is it?" "It never really was," Caleb said, settling beside her, his own hands scorched from the firefighting. "Bordeaux's not just after grazing rights. He's after control, and men like that don't stop pushing until somebody makes them stop. Or until somebody kills them," Lillian said quietly. "That's not who I am," Caleb said firmly. "I already lost myself once to that kind of anger after Daniel. I won't lose myself to it again, not even for this." "I know," Lillian said, reaching for his scorched hand, despite the pain in her own. "That's exactly why I trust you to lead this fight instead of just reacting to it." They sat together in the wreckage of the night's violence, the barn still smoldering behind them, and Lillian felt something harden inside her chest. Not fear anymore, but resolve, cold and clear as mountain water. "2 weeks until the circuit judge arrives," she said. "We need the Hendersons' testimony locked down, the Millers convinced, and Sarah Cole found before then. Bordeaux's not going to wait for us to be ready. We have to move faster than he expects." "Agreed," Caleb said. "Tomorrow we ride to Cheyenne Crossing. Start asking about Sarah Cole discreetly, see if the railroad station keeper remembers a woman traveling alone with a child some months back. And the Millers. I'll ride out again in a few days, give Robert time to think like he asked," Caleb said. Pressure won't help there. He needs to come to it himself. Lillian nodded. Exhaustion finally beginning to overtake the adrenaline that had carried her through the fire, and Caleb, noticing, pulled her gently against his side. "You did good tonight," he said quietly. "Damn good. Most folks would have stayed hidden behind that trough." "Most folks haven't spent 6 years learning that hiding never actually keeps you safe," Lillian said. "Only fighting does." They stayed like that until the sky began to lighten toward dawn. Two exhausted, soot-stained survivors leaning on each other amid the wreckage of a night that had tried and failed to break them, and somewhere in the smoke-stained air between them, unspoken but undeniable, lay a promise neither of them needed words to make. Whatever Bordeaux sent next, they would face it together or not at all. Cheyenne Crossing turned out to be larger than Lillian expected, a railroad town thick with the noise of commerce and strangers, and it took the better part of a day asking careful questions at the station house, the boarding rooms, and the small mercantile before they found a thread worth following. "Woman with a boy traveling alone came through here maybe 4 months back," the station keeper said, squinting at them with the wary suspicion of a man who'd learned not to give away information for free. "Paid cash, didn't want her name in the ledger. That the sort of thing you're asking after?" "That's exactly the sort of thing," Caleb said, sliding a coin across the counter. "Any notion where she went from here?" The station keeper pocketed the coin without hesitation. "Took a room above the seamstress shop for a spell, far as I recollect. Went by Sarah Combs, though I always figured that wasn't her Christian name, given how she flinched whenever anybody called her by it too loud." Lillian's pulse quickened. "Is she still there?" "Couldn't say. Ain't seen her around in a month or more. Might have moved on." They found the seamstress shop within the hour, a narrow storefront tucked between a saddlery and a boarding house, and the woman who ran it, a stout, no-nonsense widow named Mrs. Abernathy, eyed them both with open suspicion the moment Sarah Cole's name came up. "Don't know anybody by that name," she said flatly, arms crossed. "She went by Combs here," Lillian said gently. "We're not here to hurt her, Mrs. Abernathy. We're here because a man named Silas Bordeaux threatened her son, and stole her land through forged paperwork, the same man who's now trying to destroy Caleb Grayson's family, too. We need her testimony to stop him before he hurts anyone else." Something shifted in Mrs. Abernathy's stance at the mention of Bordeaux's name, a flicker of recognition of old anger. "That man's name," she said slowly, "has come up before in this shop." "She's still here," Caleb said, not quite a question. Mrs. Abernathy studied them both a long moment, weighing something behind her sharp eyes, before finally sighing and stepping back from the doorway. "She's out back tending the garden with her boy. But you tread careful with her, you hear. That woman's been through enough without strangers stirring up old fear." They found Sarah Cole kneeling in a small garden plot behind the shop, a boy of maybe 6 years old crouched beside her, both of them absorbed in the simple work of pulling weeds. She looked up as they approached, and Lillian watched fear flash raw and immediate across the young woman's face, before she scrambled to pull her son behind her, putting her own body between him and the strangers in her yard. "Whoever sent you," Sarah said, her voice shaking but fierce, "you can tell Bordeaux I've got nothing left to give him. He already took everything." "Nobody sent us," Lillian said quickly, holding up both hands, palms open. "My name is Lillian Harper. This is Caleb Grayson. Bordeaux's trying to steal his land the same way he stole yours, and we found your letter, Mrs. Cole, the one hidden behind the floorboard." Sarah's face went pale. "You went through my home. We were trying to find you," Caleb said gently, "to help. There's a circuit judge coming through this town in 2 weeks, and we're building a case against Bordeaux, with testimony from every family he's cheated. Yours could be the piece that finally brings him down." Sarah's arms tightened around her son, her whole body trembling now. "You don't understand what he's capable of. He threatened to take Daniel from me if I didn't sign. Said accidents happen to children who don't have fathers to protect them." Lillian's chest went tight at the coincidence of the boy's name, and she glanced at Caleb, watching some old grief flicker behind his eyes before he pushed it aside. "I understand exactly what he's capable of," Caleb said quietly. "He's the reason my own brother's dead. I know the fear you're carrying, Mrs. Cole. But hiding hasn't kept you safe these past months, has it? It's just kept you running." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and slowly her grip on her son loosened. "I can't sleep some nights wondering if he's found us, wondering if the next knock on the door is going to be his men." "Testifying could end that," Lillian said. "Could end the running for good. A federal judge with proof of fraud of threats against a child of a pattern spanning years, that's not something Bordeaux can buy his way out of, no matter how much money he's got." Sarah looked down at her son, who was watching the adults with the solemn confusion of a child too young to understand danger, but old enough to sense fear in the adults around him. "If I testify," Sarah said slowly, "will he go to prison?" "If the judge sees what we've gathered, I believe so," Caleb said. "But even if he doesn't face prison, exposing the fraud publicly, forcing him to return stolen land, ending his ability to do this to anyone else, that's a victory worth fighting for." Sarah was quiet a long moment, her hand smoothing her son's hair with an absent protective gesture. "I'll testify," she finally said. "For Daniel. So he grows up in a world where men like Bordeaux don't get to win just because they're powerful." Lillian felt tears prick her own eyes at the quiet courage in the young mother's voice, and she reached out, taking Sarah's free hand in both of hers. "Thank you," she said. "You have no idea what this means. I have some idea." Sarah said, a ghost of a smile crossing her tired face. "I've dreamed of this moment for months. Dreamed of someone finally standing up to him. I just never thought it'd be a stranger who found my hiding place and came looking." They returned to the cabin 2 days later, with Sarah Cole's testimony secured, riding through the mountain pass in the late afternoon heat, the weight of their growing case settling into something that finally felt like hope rather than desperation. But that hope shattered the moment they crested the final ridge and saw smoke rising thick and black from the direction of their land. "No!" Caleb spurred his horse forward, panic overriding caution, and Lillian followed close behind, her heart pounding with dread. They found the cabin still standing, thankfully, but the garden Lillian had worked so hard to restore lay trampled and destroyed. The fence torn down and pinned to the cabin door, with a knife, was a single sheet of paper that made Lillian's blood run cold the moment she read it. "Testify against me and everything you've built here burns next. This is your last warning, Grayson. The woman, the land, all of it. Walk away now, and I'll let you keep your life." "He knows," Lillian breathed. "He knows we found Sarah Cole. Or he's guessing, trying to scare us before we can confirm it," Caleb said, though his voice carried little conviction. "Either way, this ends now. I'm done letting him threaten what's mine from a distance." "Caleb, wait." But Caleb was already moving toward the barn, checking on the herd with sharp, urgent efficiency, and Lillian understood, watching him, that something in him had shifted the careful restraint he'd shown since the fire finally beginning to crack under the weight of repeated violence. It was as they were surveying the damage to the garden, cataloging what could be salvaged, that Lillian noticed something that made her stomach drop with sudden sick understanding. "Caleb," she said slowly, kneeling beside the trampled beans. "These tracks. They're not the same as the ones from the barn fire." Caleb crouched beside her, studying the hoof prints pressed deep into the churned earth. "You're right. Different shoes. Different horses." "That means there were 2 separate visits," Lillian said, her mind racing. "The note and whoever trampled the garden. Unless—" She stopped, a horrible thought crystallizing. "Unless what?" Caleb asked. "Unless somebody local did this," Lillian said slowly. "Somebody who knew exactly when we'd be gone, exactly how long we'd be away. Bordeaux's men wouldn't need to guess at our schedule. But somebody watching us closely, somebody who knew our movements." Caleb's face went hard with sudden understanding. "Percy Adkins, the land office clerk, or somebody else in town feeding Bordeaux information," Lillian said. "Caleb, we need to be more careful about who we trust, who we talk to. If Bordeaux's got eyes on us closer than we realized, everything we're planning could already be compromised." The realization settled heavy between them, and Caleb stood pacing the ruined garden with barely contained fury. "I should go into town," he said. "Confront Bordeaux directly, force this to a head before he can do anything worse." That's exactly what he wants, Lillian said sharply, standing to face him. Caleb, think. He's trying to provoke you into something rash, something that gives him grounds to have you arrested, or worse, before the circuit judge even arrives. Don't give him that satisfaction. Caleb's jaw worked torn between fury and reason, and Lillian stepped closer, placing both hands against his chest, feeling his heart pounding hard beneath her palms. We're closer than we've ever been, she said. 2 more witnesses secured. Sarah Cole's testimony, the forged document, the Hendersons ready to speak. We can't throw that away now because Bordeaux's trying to scare us into a mistake. Caleb's hands came up to cover hers, his breathing slowly steadying under her touch. You're right. I know you're right. It's just... His voice broke slightly. Every time I think we're safe, he finds a new way to remind us we're not. I know, Lillian said softly. But we're still standing. That has to count for something. That night, exhaustion from the day's events settled deep into both of them, and they worked together in tense, quiet efficiency to repair what they could of the garden fence before darkness made the work impossible. It was well past dark when Lillian, carrying a bundle of salvaged tools back toward the barn, felt her foot catch on a root hidden beneath the trampled earth. She went down hard, her hand instinctively reaching to break the fall, and pain exploded through her wrist and palm as it connected with the sharp edge of a fallen fence post. Lillian? Caleb was at her side in seconds, his face white with alarm in the lamplight. Let me see. Blood welled dark and steady from a deep gash across her palm, and Lillian, staring at it in the flickering light, felt the world tilt slightly with shock. It's not so bad, she said, though her voice sounded distant even to her own ears. Just needs binding. But Caleb's face, examining the wound more closely, told a different story. This needs stitching, Lillian. It's deep and dirty from the fall. Left untreated in this heat, it could turn septic within days. He carried her inside despite her protests, settling her at the scarred table and working with quick practiced efficiency to clean and dress the wound, his hands surprisingly gentle despite the urgency in his movements. You've done this before, Lillian observed, gritting her teeth against the sting of the whiskey he used to clean the cut. More times than I care to count, Caleb said grimly. Cattle work's not gentle on a man's hands, or a woman's apparently. He stitched the wound with careful precision, and Lillian, watching his face in the lamplight, saw the tension there, the fear he was trying hard not to show. You're worried, she said. I'm always worried lately, Caleb admitted. Worried Bordeaux's watching closer than we know. Worried something worse than a cut hand is coming next. Worried I brought you into danger you never asked for when I knelt down in that mud outside the church. I asked for this, Lillian said firmly. The moment I took your hand up onto that wagon, I chose this, Caleb. Every bit of it. The danger doesn't change that. Caleb finished the last stitch and sat back, studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. I never expected to feel this way about anyone again, he said quietly. Not after Daniel. I built walls so high I figured nothing could ever get through them. And now, I can't imagine a single day without you in it, Caleb said, his voice rough with an honesty that stripped away every careful defense he'd maintained. That terrifies me more than Bordeaux ever could. Lillian reached up with her uninjured hand and cupped his face, feeling the rasp of stubble against her palm. Then let it terrify you. Fear's not weakness, Caleb. It's just proof that something finally matters enough to be afraid of losing. He turned his face into her palm, pressing a kiss against the scarred skin there, and Lillian felt something in her chest crack wide open, not with pain, but with a tenderness so overwhelming it nearly brought her to tears. I love you, Caleb said suddenly, the words rough and unpolished, but utterly sincere. I know it's fast. I know we've only had a few weeks. But I love you, Lillian Harper, and I'm done pretending otherwise. Lillian's breath caught tears finally spilling over, despite every effort to hold them back. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have since you knelt down in that mud and asked if I was hurt, instead of asking if I'd survive. They kissed slowly, carefully, mindful of her injured hand, and in that small, quiet moment, surrounded by the wreckage of a garden and the looming threat of a man determined to destroy everything they'd built. Lillian felt something unshakable settle into place between them. Whatever came next, they would face it as partners, as something far deeper than an arrangement. The fever came 2 days later, sudden and violent, catching them both off guard, despite Caleb's careful attention to the wound. Lillian woke in the night, burning hot, her whole body trembling, the stitched cut across her palm swollen and angry with infection, despite his best efforts. "Caleb." Her voice was barely a whisper, thick with confusion and pain. He was beside her instantly, his hand against her forehead recoiling at the heat radiating from her skin. "God, Lillian, you're burning up. Hurts." She managed her mind already beginning to swim with fever delirium. "Everything hurts." Caleb worked fast, stripping back blankets, soaking cloths in cool water from the creek, his movements sharp with barely controlled panic. "Stay with me. Lillian, stay with me. You hear? I'm going to fix this." "Don't leave," Lillian murmured, her fever-bright eyes finding his face in the lamplight. "Please don't leave me alone. Everyone leaves. Mother left. Father left before that. Please don't." "I'm not going anywhere," Caleb said fiercely, gripping her uninjured hand tight. "Never. Do you hear me? I'm not your father. I'm not going to leave you alone in this. Not now. Not ever." Through the fever words spilled from Lillian that she would never have spoken, clearly minded fragments of old fears, old grief, old wounds she'd carried silently for years. "If I stop working," she whispered, tears mixing with sweat on her flushed face, "I get thrown away. That's what happens. Mother taught me that. Work hard enough, be useful enough, and maybe they let you stay. Stop being useful and you're nothing. You're garbage in the mud, same as Whitfield said." Caleb's face crumpled with a grief that went beyond fear for her physical safety, understanding dawning raw and painful in his gray eyes. Lillian, look at me." Her fever-bright eyes found his unfocused but present. "You are not useful to me," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are not a hired hand, not a worker I'm keeping around because you're good with a garden or handy in a kitchen. I love you. Do you understand? I love you whether you're strong or weak, whether you're working or resting, whether you're perfectly well or burning up with fever in my arms right now. Nothing you could stop doing would ever make me throw you away." Lillian's breath hitched something in her fever-addled mind, grasping desperately at his words, even as consciousness began to slip further from her grasp. "Promise?" she whispered. "I promise," Caleb said fiercely. "Now stay with me. Fight this, Lillian. Fight the way you fought Whitfield, the way you fought Bordeaux's men in the storm. Fight for me." The night stretched long and terrible. Caleb never once leaving her side, cooling her fevered skin with damp cloths, forcing water past her cracked lips, praying with a desperation he hadn't allowed himself since kneeling over his dying brother 4 years before. Near dawn, the fever finally began to break. Lillian's trembling, slowly easing into exhausted natural sleep, and Caleb, watching her breathing steady, finally allowed himself to weep silent. Relieved tears for a woman who had, in the span of a single terrible night, become more essential to his survival than he'd ever imagined possible. She woke the following afternoon, weak but lucid, to find Caleb still beside her. His eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and worry, his hand never once having released hers through the long hours of her fever. "You stayed," she murmured. "Told you I would," Caleb said, his voice rough with relief. "How do you feel?" "Weak," Lillian admitted. "Embarrassed, if I'm honest. I don't remember everything I said last night, but I remember enough to know I wasn't exactly composed." "You don't need to be embarrassed," Caleb said gently. "You told me things I needed to hear even if the telling cost you something. I understand now better than I did before exactly what kind of wounds you're carrying." Lillian's face flushed with something beyond fever. "What did I say?" "Enough for me to understand why you work so hard to be useful," Caleb said carefully. Enough for me to promise you clear-headed this time that nothing you do or don't do will ever change how I feel about you. You're not garbage in the mud, Lillian. You never were." Tears filled her eyes, and this time, weak as she was, she let them fall freely. "Nobody's ever said that to me. Not like that. Not and meant it." "I mean it," Caleb said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Every word." They stayed like that a long while. Lillian slowly recovering her strength under Caleb's careful attention. And it was 2 days later, once she was strong enough to sit at the table again, that Caleb brought her news that shattered the fragile peace they'd found. "Robert Miller sent word." He set his face grim. "He's agreed to testify." "That's good news," Lillian said, though something in Caleb's expression told her there was more. "There's more," Caleb confirmed. "Sheriff Coburn wrote out this morning. Bordeaux's filed additional paper claims, now that I coerced you into staying here against your will, that the whole arrangement's improper, and possibly criminal. He's trying to have the sheriff remove you from the property entirely, claims it's for your own protection." Lillian's stomach dropped. "He's trying to separate us before the hearing. He's trying to destroy our case any way he can," Caleb said grimly. "If he can convince the sheriff you're here under duress, it undermines everything, including your testimony about the men who threatened you in the storm." "Then we go to Coburn together," Lillian said, already pushing herself up from the table, despite her lingering weakness. "I tell him myself in my own words that I'm here because I choose to be. That nothing about this arrangement is coerced." "You're still recovering," Caleb protested. "You should rest." "I'll rest after we've stopped Bordeaux from tearing apart everything we've built," Lillian said fiercely. "I didn't survive a Boston mill, a cruel town, a knife wound, and a fever just to let that man win. Now, Caleb, help me get dressed. We're going to town." Caleb studied her a long moment, pride and worry warring behind his eyes before finally nodding. "All right. But you tell me the moment you feel weak, and we're coming straight home." "Agreed." They rode into Copper Creek together that afternoon, Lillian pale but resolute beside Caleb, and found Sheriff Coburn at his office clearly uncomfortable with the paperwork Bordeaux had filed against them. "Miss Harper," the sheriff said, surprise evident on his weathered face. "Didn't expect you to come in person." "I understand Mr. Bordeaux has suggested I'm being held against my will," Lillian said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "I'd like to state clearly, and for your records, that I am at the Grayson property entirely by my own choice. Nobody coerced me into anything. In fact, Sheriff, I intend to marry Caleb Grayson, and I'd like that stated for the record as well." The words hung in the air, and Lillian felt Caleb go rigid beside her with surprise, before something fierce and joyful broke across his face. "Lillian, I meant what I said," Lillian told him, meeting his eyes, with a steadiness that belied the racing of her heart. "I love you, Caleb Grayson, and I'm done letting Silas Bordeaux dictate the terms of my life. If you'll still have me." Caleb's answer came not in words, but in the way he pulled her close right there in the sheriff's office and kissed her with a fierce, joyful desperation that left no room for doubt. Sheriff Coburn cleared his throat, clearly caught off guard but not displeased by the display. "Well, I suppose that settles Bordeaux's claim of coercion, don't it?" "It does," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion, his forehead resting against Lillian's. "Sheriff, I want this on record too. I intend to marry this woman the moment the circuit judge finishes with Bordeaux's case. Legal proper in front of the whole county if she'll have it that way." "I'll have it exactly that way," Lillian said, laughing, despite the tears in her eyes. "Let the whole county see exactly what happens when a good man refuses to let cruelty win." But even as joy bloomed fierce and unexpected in the sheriff's office, Lillian caught sight of a figure watching through the window. Silas Bordeaux himself, his cold eyes fixed on the scene before him, his composure finally completely gone, replaced by something dark and dangerous, that promised the fight was far from over. The circuit judge would arrive in less than a week now, and Bordeaux cornered, and desperate was clearly done playing by anything resembling rules. Bordeaux moved fast. Once the sheriff's office scene made clear, his coercion claim had failed. Within 2 days, word reached the cabin through a breathless young rider from the Miller homestead. Robert Miller had been found beaten on the road into town, left barely conscious in a ditch, his testimony against Bordeaux apparently the price of the attack. "Is he alive?" Caleb demanded, already moving toward the barn. "Alive," the boy gasped. "But hurt bad. Doc's with him now. He's asking for you, Mr. Grayson. Says it's urgent." They rode hard for the Miller homestead, Lillian's stitched hand aching with the strain of gripping the reins, dread coiling tight in her stomach with every mile. They found Robert Miller propped in his bed, his face swollen and bruised nearly beyond recognition, his wife hovering close with tear-streaked cheeks. "Bordeaux's men," Robert managed through split lips. "Caught me alone on the road. Told me to withdraw my testimony, or next time it wouldn't just be me they came for. Said something about my children playing unsupervised near the river." Lillian's blood ran cold. "He threatened your children directly." "Made himself clear," Robert said grimly. "I'm sorry, Grayson. I can't testify. Not with my family's safety on the line. I hope you understand." "I understand completely," Caleb said, and Lillian heard no judgment in his voice, only grim resolve. "You've done nothing wrong, Robert. Protecting your children comes first, always." They left the Miller homestead heavier than they'd arrived, the loss of one witness, a real blow to their case. But Lillian's mind was already working through the implications with the same sharp clarity she'd learned surviving Boston's cruelest corners. "He's getting desperate," she said as they rode back toward the cabin. "Beating Robert Miller in broad daylight, threatening children directly, that's not the careful, calculated Bordeaux we met at the land office. That's a man who knows he's losing and is willing to risk everything to stop it." "Which makes him more dangerous, not less," Caleb said grimly. "Or it means he's finally showing his true face," Lillian countered. "Sheriff Coburn's not blind, Caleb. If word gets around that Bordeaux's men beat a father half to death for threatening testimony, that's not something even his money can fully bury." They reached the cabin as dusk settled purple and heavy over the mountains, and it was there, dismounting in the yard, that Lillian noticed something wrong. The cabin door standing slightly ajar, though she was certain they'd barred it that morning. "Caleb?" Her voice was low, urgent. He was already moving, rifle raised, positioning himself between Lillian and the cabin, with the same fierce protectiveness he'd shown since the night of the storm. "Stay behind me." They approached slowly, and Caleb pushed the door open with the barrel of his rifle, revealing an interior torn apart. Furniture overturned, the strongbox with their evidence gone. The mattress in the loft slashed open, its contents scattered across the floor. "He's got the documents." Lillian breathed horror washing cold through her chest. "Caleb, he's got everything. The forged filing, your father's original claim." "Not everything," Caleb said, though his voice carried its own thread of panic. He moved fast to the hearth, pressing against a loose stone Lillian hadn't noticed before, revealing a small, hidden cavity behind it. He pulled out a folded oilcloth packet, breathing a ragged sigh of relief as he unwrapped it to reveal copies, careful hand-transcribed copies of the key documents made in the quiet hours while Lillian slept off her fever. "You made copies," Lillian said, stunned. "After the barn fire," Caleb admitted. "Figured if he was willing to burn a barn, he might come after the evidence directly. Wasn't about to let one break-in destroy everything we've built." "Thank God for your caution," Lillian said, relief flooding through her. "But he doesn't know these exist. If he thinks he's destroyed our evidence entirely." "Then he'll think he's won," Caleb finished grimly. "Which means he might get careless. Might do something rash, thinking there's no more risk." They spent the rest of the evening restoring order to the cabin, and it was well past midnight, both of them exhausted from the long, brutal day, when a soft knock sounded at the cabin door. Hesitant, careful, nothing like the aggressive pounding of Bordeaux's men. Caleb answered, rifle ready to find Percy Adkins standing in the darkness, his young face pale and terrified, glancing repeatedly over his shoulder, like a man being followed. "Mr. Grayson," Percy said, his voice shaking. "I need to talk to you, please. I don't have much time." Caleb studied him warily. "You're the land office clerk, the one who filed Bordeaux's forged paper." "I know," Percy said miserably. "I know what I did, and I've hated myself for it every day since." Bordeaux paid me, threatened my mother's boarding house if I refused. But what happened to Robert Miller today, that's too far. I can't be part of that anymore. What are you offering? Lillian asked, stepping forward, cautious hope threading through her voice. The truth, Percy said. In writing signed and notarized by a colleague of mine in Cheyenne Crossing who owes Bordeaux nothing. I'll testify that Bordeaux paid me to notarize the forged claim that I've falsified records for him on at least 6 other properties across the county these past 3 years. It's everything you need to end this if you're willing to protect me from what comes after. Caleb and Lillian exchanged a look heavy with sudden fragile hope. We'll protect you, Caleb said. You have my word. Your word's worth something in this county, Percy said, managing a small, exhausted smile. More than mine ever was, I reckon. I've got the documentation with me now, proof of every falsified claim I made under Bordeaux's instruction. It's not much to make up for what I've done, but it's everything I've got. He handed over a thick bundle of papers, and Lillian, scanning them quickly in the lamplight, felt fierce, vindicated joy building in her chest. This is it, she breathed. Caleb, this is everything. Names, dates, forged signatures compared against real ones. This isn't just proof against your claim anymore. This is proof of systematic fraud across the entire county. The judge arrives in 4 days, Caleb said. Percy, are you willing to testify to all of this in person before him? Percy's hands trembled, but his voice when it came was steady with resolve. I am. Whatever it costs me. I'm done being afraid of that man. The 4 days that followed passed in a blur of careful preparation, each of them working to secure what remained fragile in their case, while watching constantly for Bordeaux's next move. Sarah Cole arrived from Cheyenne Crossing 2 days before the hearing, her young son in tow, staying discreetly at the Henderson homestead under Martha's fierce protection. The Hendersons themselves remained resolute, despite the danger their testimony locked firmly in place. And Percy Adkins, hidden away at the Grayson cabin under Caleb's watchful protection, worked tirelessly to organize the evidence of Bordeaux's systematic fraud into a case even a skeptical judge couldn't easily dismiss. But Bordeaux was not idle during those 4 days either, and on the eve of the hearing, his desperation finally boiled over into something far more dangerous than threats and forged paper. It happened as Lillian and Caleb rode into Cheyenne Crossing for the hearing. Percy and the documentation secured carefully with them the mountain road winding through a narrow pass where the rock walls rose steep on either side. Something's wrong, Lillian said suddenly, her instincts honed sharp by weeks of danger. Caleb, this is exactly the kind of place. The first shot came before she could finish the sentence, splintering the wagon seat inches from Percy's head, and chaos erupted immediately as 3 riders emerged from behind rock outcroppings on either side of the pass, rifles raised. Bordeaux's men! Caleb shouted, pulling hard on the reins, forcing the wagon into a desperate turn as another shot cracked past them. Percy, get down. They're trying to stop us before the hearing. Lillian realized her heart hammering as she grabbed the rifle Caleb had insisted she keep close since the barn fire. Caleb, if we don't reach that judge, we're reaching him, Caleb said, grim determination hardening his voice as he returned fire, forcing one rider to peel back toward cover. Whatever it takes. The wagon lurched wildly as Caleb pushed the horse into a desperate gallop, the narrow pass offering little room for maneuver, and Lillian, bracing herself against the wagon's violent movement, fired toward the pursuing riders with hands that shook but held steady enough to force them back. There! Percy shouted, pointing ahead where the pass finally began to widen. If we can reach the open ground, other travelers might see, might help. A shot found its mark before he could finish, and Percy cried out, clutching his shoulder as blood bloomed dark across his shirt. Percy! Lillian scrambled to his side, even as the wagon continued its desperate flight, pressing her hands hard against the wound. Stay with me, Percy. We're almost clear. The papers! Percy gasped, his face going pale with shock and blood loss. Protect the papers. Don't let them stop you, whatever happens to me. Nobody's dying today, Caleb snarled, pushing the horse harder as they finally broke free of the narrow pass into open ground. Other travelers on the road ahead turning in alarm at the sound of gunfire and the sight of their desperate flight. The pursuing riders, faced with witnesses now watching from the open road, finally peeled back, disappearing into the tree line as quickly as they'd appeared, and Caleb didn't slow the wagon until they'd reached the safety of Cheyenne Crossing's outskirts, breathless and shaking, but alive. "Doctor!" Caleb shouted to the gathering crowd, carrying Percy's weakened form from the wagon with desperate urgency. "Someone get a doctor now!" The town's small clinic received them quickly, and as a doctor worked to stabilize Percy's wound. Lillian sank against the clinic wall, her hands still trembling with adrenaline and fear, the full weight of how close they'd come to disaster finally crashing over her. "He's going to be all right," Caleb said, settling beside her, his own hands unsteady as he checked her over for injury with desperate thoroughness. "Doctor says the bullet missed anything vital. He'll heal." "Bordeaux tried to kill us," Lillian said, her voice shaking. "Openly in broad daylight the day before the hearing. He's completely unraveled." "Which means we've got him exactly where we need him," Caleb said grimly. "A man who resorts to open violence the day before facing a federal judge isn't a man confident in his innocence. Sheriff Coburn's going to hear about this attack within the hour, and it won't be easy for Bordeaux to explain away." As if summoned by the words themselves, Sheriff Coburn arrived at the clinic within minutes, his face grim as he took in the scene. "Word's already spreading," he said. 3 men matching descriptions of Bordeaux's known associates were seen fleeing toward his property after gunfire was reported on the mountain pass. "I've got enough now to bring him in for questioning at minimum." "At minimum," Caleb said sharply. "Sheriff, this man's tried to murder us twice now, forged land claims across this entire county, threatened women and children, and beaten a father half to death for the crime of testifying honestly. I'd say questioning is considerably less than what's warranted." "The judge arrives tomorrow morning," Coburn said. "I'll hold Bordeaux in custody tonight on suspicion pending the hearing. That's the most I can promise without overstepping what the law allows me before proper judgment's rendered." "It's enough," Lillian said, relief finally breaking through her lingering fear. "For tonight, it's enough." The hearing itself took place the following morning in Cheyenne Crossing's small courthouse, packed beyond capacity, with townsfolk drawn by weeks of escalating rumor and violence. Judge Harrison Cole, a stern man with sharp eyes that missed nothing, presided over proceedings that stretched through the entire morning and well into the afternoon. Elias and Martha Henderson testified first, their voices trembling but resolute as they detailed the forged tax lien, the burned hay stores, the threats that had forced them to sign away their eastern pasture for a fraction of its worth. "I've carried the shame of that for 2 years, Your Honor," Elias Henderson said, his weathered voice carrying clear through the packed courtroom. "Shame that should have belonged to Silas Bordeaux all along." Sarah Cole testified next, her voice breaking, as she described Bordeaux's threat against her young son, the month spent hiding the fear that had followed her every single day since fleeing Copper Creek. "He told me accidents happen to children without fathers," she said, tears streaming freely down her face as her son sat quiet and solemn beside her. "I ran because I believed him capable of making good on that threat. Your Honor, I still believe it." Percy Adkins, his arm still bound in a sling from the previous day's shooting, gave the most damning testimony of all, methodically detailing 3 years of falsified land claims, forged signatures, and systematic fraud that Bordeaux had orchestrated across the entire county, his voice growing steadier with each revelation as the weight of guilt he'd carried finally found release in honest confession. "I falsified claims against 7 different families," Percy said. "The Hendersons, the property near the river belonging to Sarah Cole. 5 others whose names I've documented in the evidence submitted to this court. Bordeaux paid me for each forgery and threatened my mother's livelihood if I ever refused or spoke out." Bordeaux's lawyer, a sharp-featured man brought in from Denver at considerable expense, worked desperately to discredit each witness, painting Percy as a disgruntled employee seeking to escape blame, dismissing Sarah Cole's testimony as the paranoid imaginings of a grieving widow, questioning whether the Hendersons' aging memories could be trusted after so many years. But it was Caleb's testimony, delivered with the same quiet, unshakable resolve that had first drawn Lillian to him in the mud outside Copper Creek's church, that finally shifted the courtroom's mood entirely. "My father filed his original claim the year I was born," Caleb said, holding up the authentic document alongside Bordeaux's forgery for the judge's careful comparison. "I've lived on that land my entire life. I lost my brother defending it against Bordeaux's earlier attempts to seize it through intimidation. And these past 2 months, I've watched this man attempt everything from arson to attempted murder in his effort to steal what's rightfully mine." "Objection!" Bordeaux's lawyer interjected. "Speculation regarding intent." "Overruled," Judge Cole said sharply. "Mr. Grayson, continue. 2 days ago, on the road to this very hearing, Mr. Bordeaux's men opened fire on our wagon, wounding Mr. Adkins and endangering the lives of everyone present." Caleb continued. "Sheriff Coburn can confirm the men fled toward Bordeaux's property immediately after. This isn't a man defending a legitimate land claim, Your Honor. This is a man willing to kill to protect a fraud he's built over years at the expense of every family too weak or too frightened to fight back." The courtroom had gone utterly silent, and Lillian, watching from the gallery, felt fierce pride swell in her chest at the strength and clarity in Caleb's testimony. Judge Cole's sharp eyes moved finally to Bordeaux himself, who sat rigid and pale at the defendant's table, his careful composure entirely abandoned now. "Mr. Bordeaux," the judge said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "you've heard testimony from 7 witnesses, documented evidence of forged land claims spanning 3 years, and first-hand accounts of arson and attempted murder committed by men in your employ. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Bordeaux's composure finally shattered completely. "This is a conspiracy," he snarled, rising from his seat, despite his lawyer's restraining hand. "These people are lying, all of them coerced by Grayson into fabricating—" "Sit down, Mr. Bordeaux," Judge Cole said sharply, "or I'll have you removed from this courtroom entirely." Bordeaux sank back into his seat, his face contorted with fury and desperation, and the judge turned his attention to the assembled courtroom with the gravity of a man about to render final judgment. "Having reviewed the evidence presented," Judge Cole said, "including handwriting analysis confirming the forgery of the Grayson land claim testimony from Mr. Adkins, detailing systematic fraud across 7 separate properties, and first-hand accounts of violence committed against multiple witnesses. In an attempt to obstruct this very proceeding, this court finds sufficient grounds to void all fraudulent claims filed by Silas Bordeaux against the properties in question." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, hope and vindication mixing in equal measure among the assembled witnesses. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "given the severity of evidence regarding attempted murder on the road to this hearing and the pattern of violence and intimidation documented throughout these proceedings, I am ordering Mr. Bordeaux held for federal trial on charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit murder. Sheriff Coburn, take him into custody immediately." The courtroom erupted into a mixture of gasps and quiet relieved weeping. As Sheriff Coburn moved to place Bordeaux in irons, the man's face a mask of disbelief and fury as the full weight of consequence finally landed after years of unchecked cruelty. "You'll regret this, Grayson," Bordeaux snarled as the sheriff led him from the courtroom. "This isn't over." "It's over, Bordeaux," Caleb said quietly, his voice carrying easily through the hushed courtroom. "It's been over since the moment you decided threatening innocent families was an acceptable cost of doing business. Justice just took longer to arrive than it should have." The weeks that followed the hearing brought a transformation to Copper Creek that Lillian could scarcely have imagined during her first humiliating morning in that mud-soaked churchyard. The Hendersons' eastern pasture was returned to them by federal order, and Elias Henderson wept openly at the courthouse when the deed was finally restored to his name. Sarah Cole's property near the river was likewise returned, and she and her young son settled back into their small cabin with a security they hadn't known in months. Robert Miller, still healing from his injuries, watched with quiet satisfaction as Bordeaux's federal trial date was set, the man's considerable fortune already beginning to unravel under the weight of mounting civil suits from every family he'd defrauded. Percy Adkins, in recognition of his crucial testimony and genuine remorse, was granted leniency by the court in exchange for his continued cooperation in unwinding the full extent of Bordeaux's fraudulent claims, and Caleb, in a gesture that surprised the whole county, offered the young man honest work on the Grayson ranch. Once his shoulder healed a fresh start, far removed from the corruption that had once controlled him. But it was the quiet moments away from courthouses and testimonies, and the machinery of justice finally turning in their favor, that meant the most to Lillian. She stood in the restored garden behind the cabin on a warm afternoon, 3 weeks after the hearing. Tending the beans and squash that had somehow survived Bordeaux's earlier destruction, when Caleb approached from the barn, something careful and nervous in his expression that immediately caught her attention. "You've got a look about you," she said, straightening from her work, wiping dirt from her hands onto her apron. "Do I?" Caleb's attempt at casualness fooled neither of them. "Caleb Grayson, in 3 months of knowing you, I've watched you face armed men without flinching," Lillian said, amusement warming her voice. "What exactly has you this nervous now?" Caleb reached into his coat pocket, and Lillian's breath caught as he withdrew a small ring, simple but beautifully made, clearly crafted with careful attention. "I had this made in Cheyenne Crossing." He said, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer bothered hiding. "Was going to wait for some perfect moment, some grand gesture worthy of everything you've done for this family, for this county. But I've learned these past months that perfect moments don't wait for us to be ready for them. Sometimes you just have to reach for what matters and trust it'll be enough." He knelt right there in the garden soil, the same soil his mother had once tended, the same soil that had begun its own slow healing alongside everything else Bordeaux's cruelty had tried to destroy. "Lillian Harper," Caleb said, 3 months ago, "I found you in the mud outside a church abandoned by a man too small to recognize what he was throwing away. I told the whole town I'd take you up this mountain on nothing but an arrangement work, for keep nothing more expected. I didn't know then that I was about to find the one thing I'd stopped believing I deserved after losing Daniel. Someone who'd stand beside me, not because she had to, but because she chose to every single day, through fire and fever and men with guns trying to tear us apart." Tears streamed freely down Lillian's face now, and she made no effort to stop them. "I love you," Caleb continued, his own eyes bright with unshed emotion. "Not because you're useful, not because you cook or garden or fight like hell when danger comes calling. I love you because you looked up at me from that mud and refused to be anything less than exactly who you are. Will you marry me, Lillian? Properly before God and this whole county as my wife and my partner, and the only person I ever want beside me for whatever comes next." "Yes," Lillian said, the word breaking free on a sob of pure joy. "Yes, Caleb, 1,000 times yes." He rose and swept her into his arms, and Lillian, laughing and crying in equal measure, felt every hard year of her life. The mill, her mother's death, Whitfield's cruelty, Bordeaux's violence, finally settle into something that made sense, finally arrive at a destination worth every step of the difficult journey. They married 3 weeks later on a clear summer morning, with the whole mountain valley spread golden and green below the small church that had once witnessed Lillian's deepest humiliation. This time, when she walked toward the altar, no one laughed. No one turned away. The Hendersons sat proudly in the front pew, Martha dabbing tears throughout the entire ceremony. Sarah Cole's young son served as an eager, if slightly clumsy, ring-bearer, delighted with his important role. Robert Miller, fully healed now, stood with his wife and children among the packed congregation, and even Sheriff Coburn attended his presence, a quiet acknowledgement of how thoroughly the town's understanding of justice and of Caleb Grayson himself had shifted. Percy Adkins, working now as an honest hand on the Grayson ranch, stood near the back, still shy about his welcome among people he'd once wronged, but present nonetheless, determined to be part of the community's healing. When the preacher finally pronounced them husband and wife, Caleb kissed Lillian with a tenderness that held nothing back. No careful reserve, no walls left standing between them, and the whole congregation erupted into joyful applause that seemed to shake the very mountains surrounding Copper Creek. Later, standing together in the garden behind what was now truly their home, watching the sun set, gold and rose over peaks that had once seemed distant and forbidding, Lillian rested her head against Caleb's shoulder, feeling his arms secure and warm around her. "Do you ever think about that morning?" she asked quietly. "In the mud outside the church." "Every day," Caleb admitted. "Think about how close I came to riding past to minding my own business the way half that crowd expected me to. Think about how different everything might have turned out if I hadn't knelt down." "But you did," Lillian said. "You knelt down and you asked if I was hurt instead of asking if I'd survive. That question changed everything. You changed everything," Caleb corrected gently. "The moment you looked up at me and refused to be ashamed, refused to let that town's cruelty define you. I just had the good sense to recognize something extraordinary when it was standing right in front of me." Lillian smiled, watching the last light fade behind the mountains that had become against every hard lesson her life had taught her to expect. Not a prison of survival, but a home built on partnership, love, and the hard-won knowledge that some people against all odds were worth trusting completely. "Silas Bordeaux tried to break us," she said. "Tried to burn what we built, threatened everything we hold dear, and instead he only proved how strong that foundation really was." "That's what he never understood," Caleb said, pressing a kiss into her hair. "Men like Bordeaux measure strength in money and threats and violence. They never learn that real strength is standing beside someone through every storm, every fever, every fire, until the storm finally breaks, and all that's left standing is what truly matters." Lillian turned in his arms to face him fully, this man who had knelt in the mud for a stranger, and found in that single act of decency the beginning of everything that mattered most. "I love you, Caleb Grayson," she said. "Not because you saved me from that town, but because you taught me I never needed saving at all. I just needed someone brave enough to stand beside me while I saved myself." "Then we're the same," Caleb said softly. "Because you taught me the exact same thing." They stood together as the last light faded fully into evening. Two people who had each carried their own private griefs into a chance meeting on a muddy church step, and who had built from that unlikely beginning something neither cruelty nor corruption nor violence had ever managed to break. The mountain that had once seemed only a place of solitary survival had become at last a true and lasting home, and against every terrible thing this hard world had once taught them both to expect. Caleb and Lillian Grayson had found exactly what they never believed they deserved, a love strong enough to weather any storm, and a life built not on fear, but on the unshakable certainty of standing together always for whatever came next.